The thick mahogany door of Dr. Harrison's office closed behind Irene Hammond with the finality of a coffin lid. 6 months. The words hung in the air around her as she stepped onto Boston's crowded sidewalk. 6 months to live. Perhaps less. The autumn wind cut through her wool coat, but she barely felt it. Her mind was still trapped in that dimly lit office, with its smell of carbolic acid and the doctor's carefully practiced expression of sympathy. "The condition of your heart has deteriorated significantly, Miss Hammond. I cannot in good conscience offer false hope." Irene walked without purpose through streets turning golden with fallen leaves. Shop windows displayed their wares, children chased hoops along the cobblestones. And everywhere, people hurried about with the luxury of futures stretching before them like endless roads. 6 months to see all the roads come to a single abrupt end. She found herself at the doorstep of Mrs. Holloway's boarding house as evening shadows lengthened across Boston. The familiar scent of boiled cabbage greeted her as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room on the third floor. 4 years she had lived here ever since the fever had taken her family and left her strangely, cruelly alive. Her room was as she had left it that morning, small, neat, and impersonal. A stranger looking at it would find little evidence of the woman who occupied it. No photographs, no mementos, just books on medicine, a few modest dresses, and the tools of her former nursing trade. Irene sank onto her narrow bed, her fingers absently tracing the faded pattern on the quilt. Outside her window, a robin alighted briefly on the sill before taking flight again. She watched it disappear into the distance, a spot of red against the graying sky. 6 months, she whispered to the empty room. Her gaze fell on the morning's newspaper still folded where she had left it on her small desk. She reached for it without thinking, needing something, anything, to occupy her mind. As she unfolded the Boston Morning Post, a small advertisement in the back pages caught her eye. "Wife wanted. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks sturdy woman of good health and practical disposition. Must be willing to work. References required. Reply to E. Sullivan Crow's Bend, Montana Territory." A bark of laughter escaped her lips, sharp and unfamiliar in the quiet room. How inappropriate that this, of all things, should catch her attention today. A man seeking a sturdy woman of good health. Everything she was not. She started to turn the page, but paused. An image formed in her mind: vast open skies, mountains touching clouds, endless prairie grass swaying in the wind. Places she had only read about, would never see now. "If I am to die," she said softly to herself, "why not die after truly living?" The thought came unbidden, startling in its clarity. What did she have to lose? What was there for her in Boston but a lonely room and a lonely death? Irene smoothed the newspaper on her lap. She read the advertisement again, and for the first time since leaving Dr. Harrison's office, felt something other than despair. She rose and moved to her desk, pulling out paper and pen. "Dear Mr. Sullivan." Her hand hovered over the page. This was madness. Yet what was madness to someone with 6 months to live? She began to write. Memories of the yellow fever epidemic haunted Irene's dreams that night. The hospital tent in South Carolina, row upon row of cots, the stench of vomit, and worse. Her fingers steady, despite her exhaustion, pressing cool cloths to burning foreheads. The doctor's voice: "Miss Hammond, another one's gone." She woke before dawn, sheets tangled around her legs, her nightgown damp with sweat. For a moment, the familiar panic seized her, the fear that she too had contracted the disease that had claimed her parents and brother. Then reality returned, not yellow fever. her heart. A different, slower death sentence. Irene lit the lamp beside her bed. The letter she had written to E. Sullivan lay on her desk, sealed and ready for posting. In the flickering light, doubt crept in. She had lied in that letter, lied about her health, her strength, her very nature. "What choice did I have?" she whispered to the shadows. "Tell him I'm dying, that I just want to see Montana before I go." Mrs. Holloway was already in the kitchen when Irene came downstairs, her letter tucked inside her pocket. "You're up with the birds today," the older woman observed, sliding a cup of tea across the worn table. "I have errands to run before my shift at the dispensary," Irene replied, accepting the tea gratefully. Mrs. Holloway studied her with shrewd eyes. "Harrison gave you bad news, didn't he?" Irene looked up, startled. She had told no one about her appointment. "These old eyes have seen enough to know when death has marked someone," Mrs. Holloway said gently. "How long? 6 months? Perhaps less." The words were easier to say the second time. "I've been dismissed from the dispensary. They don't want a nurse who might collapse while tending patients." Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue in disapproval. "After all you did during the fever outbreak, ungrateful, the lot of them." Irene's hand moved to her pocket, feeling the edge of the envelope. "I'm considering a change." "What sort of change?" "Montana." Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows shot up. "Montana? Whatever for a new start." Irene hesitated. "There's an advertisement, a rancher seeking a wife. A mail-order bride, you—" The older woman's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, I understand the impulse to run, but—" "I'm not running," Irene interrupted. "I'm finally going somewhere, doing something." She pulled out the letter. "I'll likely be dead before winter's end, Mrs. Holloway. I'd rather die beneath Montana's big sky than in that little room upstairs." Mrs. Holloway was silent for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and squeezed Irene's hand. "Post your letter, then. And when he replies, I'll help you pack." 3 weeks later, a letter arrived bearing the Montana Territory postmark. The journey west was a blur of rattling train carriages, dusty stagecoaches, and strange beds in strange towns. Irene watched America transform outside her window, neat eastern farmland, giving way to the vast rolling prairies, then the distant silhouettes of mountains as rising like giants on the horizon. Each mile took her further from everything familiar and closer to a future she could scarcely imagine. She had exchanged several letters with Ezra Sullivan, each carefully crafted to present herself as the capable, healthy woman he sought. His replies had been brief, practical, but not unkind. He wrote of his ranch, the whispering pine of the town of Crow's Bend, and of practical arrangements for their marriage upon her arrival. Now, as the stagecoach bounced along the rutted trail into Montana Territory, doubts plagued her once more. The other passengers, a drummer selling farm equipment, an elderly couple returning from visiting relatives in St. Louis, and a young man seeking work in the mines, had grown used to her periodic coughing fits, politely averting their eyes when they occurred. "First time to Montana, miss?" the elderly woman asked during a relatively smooth stretch of road. Irene nodded. "Yes, I'm meeting someone." The woman smiled knowingly. "A beau? A husband? Well, soon to be." The words felt strange on her tongue. "Mail order," the woman's husband asked bluntly, earning a sharp elbow from his wife. "Edgar, that's not polite." "It's all right," Irene said. "Yes, I've never met him." The old man harumphed. "Risky business, that. Half the men out here advertising for wives are looking for free labor, not love." "Edgar, stop it," his wife scolded. "Don't listen to him, dear. I'm sure your gentleman is perfectly respectable." Irene managed a tight smile. I hope so. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the stagecoach crested a hill, and the driver called back, "Crow's Bend up ahead, folks." Irene leaned toward the window. In the valley below, a small collection of buildings huddled along what appeared to be a main street. A church steeple, whitewashed in the late afternoon sun, stood tallest among them. Beyond the town, the land opened up into a patchwork of ranches and farms green against the golden prairie grasses. "Not much to look at," the drummer commented, "but I hear they're growing. Got the new telegraph line just last year." The stagecoach rattled down the hill and into town, passing a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Crow's Bend. Pop, 342. Irene's heart hammered against her ribs, a painful reminder of her condition. This was it. There was no turning back now. They pulled to a stop outside what appeared to be a combination of general store and post office. A small crowd had gathered, as was customary whenever the stage arrived with mail and news from the outside world. Irene scanned the faces, wondering which belonged to Ezra Sullivan. The driver opened the door. "Crow's Bend, folks, 30-minute stop before we continue to Fort Benton." The other passengers disembarked, but Irene remained frozen in her seat. This wasn't a 30-minute stop for her. This was her destination, the end of her journey and the beginning of whatever time she had left. "Miss," the driver prompted, "you getting out here?" Irene gathered her courage and her small handbag. Yes, I am." As she stepped down from the coach, she was acutely aware of the curious stares directed her way. Her travel dress, once neat and proper, was now wrinkled and dust-covered. Her hat sat askew atop her dark hair, which had mostly escaped its pins during the jolting ride. "Excuse me," she asked the driver as he unloaded bags from the top of the coach. "I'm looking for Ezra Sullivan." Before the man could answer, a woman's voice called out, "You must be the bride." A plump, middle-aged woman with graying red hair approached, her face alight with curiosity. "I'm Virginia Caldwell. I run the mercantile with my husband." She gave Irene a quick assessment, her expression faltering slightly. You've had a long journey, haven't you? You look positively exhausted, poor thing." Is Mr. Sullivan here?" Irene asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Virginia's expression grew odd. "He's over by the livery. Been pacing there for the last hour." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I should warn you, dear, Ezra Sullivan isn't the most approachable man in these parts. Keeps to himself mostly. Some folks find him a bit intimidating." "Thank you for the warning," Irene replied, unsure what else to say. "Your trunk?" the driver asked, having unloaded most of the luggage. "The small one with the blue ribbon," Irene answered, pointing to her modest traveling trunk. As the driver set her trunk on the boardwalk, a murmur went through the gathered townspeople. Irene followed their gaze to a tall figure approaching from the direction of the livery stable. Ezra Sullivan was not what she had expected. He stood well over 6 feet broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His face, partially hidden beneath a dark beard flecked with gray, was deeply tanned and weathered. He wore no jacket, despite the autumn chill, just a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, simple trousers, and worn boots. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed eyes that Irene couldn't yet make out. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone in a stream. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own body, yet there was something coiled and watchful in his bearing, like a predator assessing its surroundings. He stopped several feet from Irene and for a long moment simply looked at her. His eyes, she could now see, were a startling blue sky, blue, cold as winter. Those eyes traveled from her face to her slight frame. taking in her obvious exhaustion, the way she braced herself against the stagecoach to remain upright. Something flickered across his features. Disappointment. Anger. It was gone too quickly to identify. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough, as if unused to conversation. "This isn't what I ordered." The words hung in the air between them, heard clearly by everyone gathered around. Someone gasped. Virginia Caldwell made a small, disapproving noise. Irene felt heat rise to her cheeks. Anger, unexpected and fierce, burned through her exhaustion. She straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. "I'm not a catalog purchase, Mr. Sullivan. I'm a woman who has traveled over 2,000 miles to meet you. The least you could offer is a proper greeting." For a moment, genuine surprise registered on his face. Then his expression hardened once more. "Get your trunk," he said curtly. "Wagons this way." Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking back toward the livery. Irene stood rooted to the spot, humiliation and rage warring within her. She had known this was a risk, that the man might not be what she hoped. But she hadn't expected such blatant rudeness, such public rejection. "Don't mind Ezra," Virginia whispered, appearing at her side. "He's always been a bear, especially since— well, never mind that now. Do you want to stay at the boarding house instead? Mrs. Peterson has rooms." Irene watched Ezra Sullivan's retreating back. She had come too far to give up at the first hurdle. 6 months to live. What did a little humiliation matter against that? "No," she replied, straightening her hat. "I made an agreement. I intend to honor it." "You're braver than you look," Virginia said with newfound respect. She signaled to a young boy loitering nearby. "Jimmy, help the lady with her trunk. Take it to Mr. Sullivan's wagon." As Irene followed the boy, she heard whispers behind her. "Poor creature looks half dead already." "Not what Sullivan advertised for, that's certain. Won't last a month out at Whispering Pine." She lifted her chin and kept walking. They might be right. She might not last a month. But it would be a month on her terms under Montana's vast sky, facing whatever came with her eyes wide open. The wagon creaked and swayed along the rutted trail leading away from Crow's Bend. Ezra Sullivan sat beside Irene on the bench seat, his large hands holding the reins loosely, his attention seemingly focused entirely on the path ahead. They had not exchanged a single word since leaving town. Irene's trunk was secured in the wagon bed behind them, along with supplies Ezra had purchased in town, sacks of flour and sugar coffee beans, nails, ammunition, and various other necessities. A rifle lay within easy reach beside him, a stark reminder of the wilderness they were entering. The sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Despite her exhaustion and the awkwardness of her situation, Irene couldn't help but be moved by the beauty surrounding them. Rolling grasslands stretched to the horizon, dotted with stands of pine and aspen. In the distance, a herd of pronghorn antelope grazed, their forms delicate against the vast landscape. "It's beautiful," she said, breaking the silence. "I've never seen anything like it." Ezra glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the trail. "Gets cold in winter. Below zero for weeks sometimes. Winds that cut right through you." "I see." Irene understood the implied message. This land, beautiful as it was, would not be kind to someone as frail as she appeared. More silence followed. Irene studied her companion's profile surreptitiously. His beard was neatly trimmed, contrary to her expectations of a frontier rancher. The lines around his eyes spoke of years squinting into the sun. There was a small scar near his right temple disappearing into his hairline. "How much further to your ranch?" she asked when the silence grew too heavy. Whispering Pine is about 7 miles from town, he answered. We'll be there before dark. But you named your ranch. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. My father named it. Said the sound of wind through the pines reminded him of whispers. It was the most he'd said at once, and Irene seized the opportunity to continue the conversation. Have you lived there all your life? Most of it, and just like that, the moment of openness was gone. They crested a small rise, and Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop. There it is. Irene followed his gaze to the valley below. Nestled against a backdrop of pine forest was a collection of buildings that comprised the Whispering Pine Ranch. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. A large barn stood nearby, along with corrals, a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods turning golden in the autumn light. It's impressive, she said honestly. Been in my family 3 generations, Ezra replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Started with a 1-room cabin. My grandfather built it up. My father expanded it. Now it's mine. He flicked the reins, and the horses began the descent into the valley. As they drew closer, Irene could see details she had missed from a distance. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. Cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. A few men moved about the yard, tending to end-of-day chores. They pulled up before the house, just as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard. A woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and a face lined by years of prairie sun and wind. Right on time, Ezra, she called, then caught sight of Irene. Her expression shifted to one of surprised delight. And you must be Miss Hammond. We've been so looking forward to meeting you. Ezra jumped down from the wagon and tied the horses to a hitching post. Without offering to help Irene down, he began unloading the supplies from the back. The woman approached the wagon, shooting a disapproving glance at Ezra's back, before turning a warm smile to Irene. Don't mind him. No manners to speak of. I'm Martha Watson, housekeeper here at Whispering Pine. She extended a hand to help Irene down. You must be exhausted after your journey. Come inside, dear. I've got supper ready and a hot bath waiting for you. Irene accepted the assistance gratefully, her legs stiff from the long ride. Thank you, Mrs. Watson. That sounds wonderful. Just Martha, dear. We don't stand on ceremony out here. She looked over Irene with motherly concern. You're thinner than your letters suggested. Nothing we can't fix with good Montana beef and my sourdough bread. Irene felt a stab of guilt at the reminder of her deception. The journey was more taxing than I anticipated. And of course, it was crossing half the country would tax anyone. Martha took Irene's arm supportively. Let's get you settled. Ezra can bring your trunk in. As Martha led her toward the house, Irene glanced back at Ezra. He was watching them, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, hefting a sack of flour onto his shoulder. The interior of the house was a revelation. While the outside was sturdy and practical, the inside spoke of generations of careful stewardship. The wide entryway opened to a spacious living room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Polished wood floors gleamed in the lamplight, and well-made furniture, some clearly brought from the east at great expense, was arranged for both comfort and conversation. Most surprising of all was the bookcase that covered an entire wall filled with leather-bound volumes. This is unexpected, Irene admitted, drawn to the bookcase. Martha smiled knowingly. Most people are surprised. They expect a crude cabin with bearskin rugs, I suppose. The Sullivan men have always valued education, even out here on the frontier. Irene ran her fingers along the spines of the books. Medical texts, history, literature, philosophy. The collection was extensive and eclectic. These are Mr. Sullivan's, his and his father's, before him, and his grandfather's before that. Ezra adds to the collection whenever he travels to Helena or Denver. Martha gestured toward a hallway. Come along, dear. Let me show you to your room so you can freshen up before supper. Irene followed Martha down a long hallway, noting the quality of the furnishings and the framed landscapes on the walls. They passed what was clearly the master bedroom. The door was ajar, revealing a large four-poster bed and a masculine decor. Martha continued to the very end of the hall, opening the door to a small room that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the house. It contained a narrow bed, a simple washstand, a small chest of drawers, and little else. The single window looked out onto what appeared to be a chicken coop. It's not much, Martha admitted, looking embarrassed. But it's clean. I put fresh linens on the bed this morning. It's fine, Irene assured her, though she couldn't help wondering why she had been given what was clearly the least desirable room in the house. The bathroom is down the hall. I've already heated water for your bath. Martha hesitated. Ezra will bring your trunk shortly. Supper's in half an hour, but take your time. I can keep a plate warm for you. Thank you, Martha. You're very kind. After the older woman left, Irene sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and uncertainty. What had she gotten herself into? The man she had agreed to marry clearly regretted his decision on sight. She was quartered as far from him as the house allowed, in a room barely better than a servant's quarters. The door opened without a knock, and Ezra entered carrying her trunk, as if it weighed nothing. He set it down at the foot of the bed, straightened, and finally looked directly at her. Meals are at 6 morning and evening, he said flatly. Martha leaves breakfast for the hands at 5. I expect you to take over the cooking and household duties once you're settled. His gaze flickered over her with obvious doubt about her ability to handle such tasks. I understand, Irene replied, determined not to show weakness. The preacher comes through town once a month. He'll be here next week. We can make things official then, if you still want to. His tone suggested he expected her to change her mind. And if I don't want to? His expression didn't change. Stage leaves for Fort Benton every Thursday. You can be on it. With that, he turned to leave. Mr. Sullivan, Irene called, stopping him at the door. I'd like to understand something. You advertised for a wife. I responded. We corresponded. I came all this way, and now you act as if my very presence offends you. What exactly did I misrepresent that has disappointed you so thoroughly? He turned back, his blue eyes cold. You said you were healthy and strong, capable of hard work. The woman who stepped off that stage looks like she'd blow away in the first winter storm. The truth of his assessment stung, but Irene refused to flinch. Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Sullivan. I may not be what you expected, but I am here, and I intend to fulfill my part of our agreement. We'll see, he said, and closed the door behind him. Alone once more, Irene opened her trunk and removed her nightgown and robe. She found the bathroom where Martha had prepared a bath, the water still wonderfully warm. As she sank into it, letting the heat soothe her travel-weary body, she fought back tears of frustration and exhaustion. 6 months to live, perhaps less, and she had chosen to spend them here with a man who clearly wished she had never come. No self-pity, she whispered to herself, echoing the mantra that had carried her through the yellow fever epidemic. One day at a time, one task at a time. She would prove herself useful, even if it was the last thing she did. Irene woke before dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room. A rooster crowed somewhere outside her window, reminding her where she was. Montana, Whispering Pine Ranch, the home of a man who had made it clear she wasn't welcome. She dressed quickly, in her plainest work dress, pinned her dark hair in a simple knot, and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Martha was already there, stoking the cast-iron stove and mixing batter for biscuits. "Good morning, dear. I didn't expect you up so early after your long journey," the older woman said cheerfully. "I wanted to help with breakfast," Irene replied, tying an apron around her waist. "What can I do?" "You can slice that ham for frying," Martha suggested, pointing to a large ham on the cutting board. "The men will be in from the bunkhouse soon, hungry as bears." Irene set to work, pleased that her hands remained steady, despite her fatigue. She had always been good with a knife, a skill learned during her nursing days. "How many men work here?" she asked as she sliced. "5 regular hands plus Samuel Reed, the foreman. He's been with the Sullivans for over 30 years. Martha worked as she talked, her movements efficient. "There's young Caleb Jenkins, he's just 20, came to us as an orphan 5 years back. Diego Martinez handles the horses, best wrangler in 3 counties. Then there's Bill Thompson and the Wilson brothers, Tom and Frank. Good men, all of them. And they all eat breakfast here." Martha nodded. "In the kitchen. Dinner too, except Sundays, when they fend for themselves or go into town." She glanced at Irene. "It's a lot of cooking, I won't lie. One reason Ezra wanted a wife, I suspect. My hands aren't what they used to be with the arthritis." Irene noted the older woman's swollen knuckles. "Does it pain you greatly? Some days worse than others. Cold weather makes it fierce." Martha shrugged. "Part of getting old, I suppose." They worked side by side, preparing a breakfast that would have fed twice the number Martha had mentioned: ham, biscuits, gravy, fried potatoes, eggs, and strong coffee. Just as they finished, the back door opened, and men began filing in, stamping their boots, and bringing with them the smell of morning dew and horses. First through the door was an older man with a weathered face and a shock of white hair. His eyes, sharp and assessing, found Irene immediately. "You must be Miss Hammond," he said, removing his hat. "Samuel Reed, ma'am, foreman here at Whispering Pine." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Reed," Irene replied, oddly, touched by his courtesy after Ezra's coldness. "Just Sam, ma'am. Everyone calls me Sam." He introduced the others as they entered: young Caleb with his shock of blonde hair and shy smile, Diego dark-eyed and dignified, Bill, Tom, and Frank, all cut from the same cloth of sturdy, taciturn ranch hands. They seated themselves around the large kitchen table, their manner suggesting this was a long-established routine. Martha began serving, but Irene stepped forward. "Please, let me," she said, taking the platter of ham. "You sit and rest your hands." Martha looked about to protest, then nodded gratefully. Irene moved around the table, serving each man in turn. She was aware of their curious glances, their whispered thanks. Last to enter the kitchen was Ezra. He paused in the doorway, clearly surprised to see Irene up and working. For a brief moment, something like approval flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by his now familiar neutral expression. "Morning," he said curtly, taking his seat at the head of the table. Irene served him last, careful to meet his gaze as she did so. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan." Breakfast proceeded with the men discussing the day's work: fences that needed mending, cattle to be moved to lower pastures before the first snow, a mare about to foal. Ezra spoke little, but when he did, the others listened attentively. It was clear they respected him, though whether from admiration or fear, Irene couldn't yet tell. As they ate, Sam turned to Irene. Martha tells me you were a nurse back east, Miss Hammond. Irene nodded, surprised that Martha knew this detail from her letters. Yes, during and after the war, most recently at a dispensary in Boston. A nurse? Young Caleb exclaimed. Like Clara Barton. Irene smiled at his enthusiasm. Not nearly so distinguished, but yes, similar work. I must have seen some terrible things, Bill Thompson commented, his voice gruff, but not unkind. Yes, Irene admitted, but also remarkable recoveries. The human body has an astonishing capacity to heal under the right circumstances. Healing's all well and good, Ezra cut in, his tone dismissive. But out here we need practical skills. Cooking, cleaning, mending, running a household. An awkward silence fell over the table. Martha shot Ezra a disapproving look. I assure you, Mr. Sullivan, I'm quite capable of running a household, Irene replied evenly, and nursing is nothing if not practical. It teaches one to work efficiently under pressure and to waste nothing, neither time nor resources. Several of the men exchanged glances, clearly impressed by her composure in the face of Ezra's challenge. We'll see, he said again, pushing back from the table. Got work to do. Men meet me at the north pasture in 20 minutes. As the men filed out with murmured thanks for the meal, Sam lingered behind. Don't mind the boss, Miss Hammond, he said quietly. He's been through some hard times. Takes a while to warm up to newcomers. So I've gathered, Irene replied. Though warm isn't a word I'd associate with Mr. Sullivan. Sam's weathered face creased in a smile. No, I suppose not. But he's a good man at heart, best I've ever worked for. I'll take your word for it, Sam. After the men left, Irene helped Martha clear the table and wash the dishes. The older woman moved slowly, clearly, in pain, despite her efforts to hide it. Why don't you let me handle the kitchen today? Irene suggested. You can show me where everything is kept, and then perhaps you could rest your hands. Martha looked relieved. Are you sure, dear? It's a lot to take on your first day. I'm certain, Irene assured her. Besides, how else will I learn my way around? The morning passed in domestic activity. Martha showed Irene the pantry, the root cellar, the chicken coop, and the kitchen garden, now mostly harvested for the coming winter. Irene took mental notes of everything, determined to master the workings of the household as quickly as possible. By mid-morning, she had bread rising on the counter, a stew simmering for dinner, and was preparing to tackle the laundry. Martha had reluctantly agreed to rest, clearly unused to being idle, but grateful for the respite. Irene was hanging sheets on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She turned to see a woman riding toward the house, her posture elegant atop a sleek chestnut mare. The woman reined in near Irene, her assessing gaze making Irene acutely aware of her work dress and wind-blown hair. You must be Ezra's mail-order bride, the woman said without preamble. Her voice held the cultured tones of someone educated in the East, at odds with her frontier attire of split riding skirt and tailored jacket. Irene Hammond, Irene replied, wiping her hands on her apron. And you are Judith Blackwood. The woman dismounted gracefully. She was perhaps in her late 30s, handsome rather than beautiful, with auburn hair swept into a fashionable coiffure beneath her riding hat. My ranch borders Whispering Pine to the east. There was something proprietary in the way she said, my ranch, that suggested she considered herself a person of importance. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood, Irene said politely. Miss Blackwood, Judith corrected. Or rather, Mrs. Blackwood, but I prefer not to use my late husband's title. I run the Blackwood Ranch myself since his passing 3 years ago. Impressive, Irene said sincerely. Running a ranch was difficult enough for a man. For a woman to do so successfully spoke of remarkable determination. Judith's expression softened slightly. Yes, well, I had little choice. Robert left considerable debts. It was either take over or lose everything. She glanced toward the house. Is Ezra about? He's at the north pasture with the men, Irene replied, noting the familiar way Judith used Ezra's first name. Ah, moving the herd to winter grazing. I should have guessed. Judith studied Irene more closely. You're not what I expected. So I've been told, repeatedly. Judith had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I simply meant the women who answer these advertisements are usually more robust. I'm stronger than I look, Irene said, the words becoming a mantra she was determined to prove true. I hope so for your sake. Winters here are brutal, and Ezra works his people hard. Judith's tone held a warning. He's not an easy man to live with. So I've gathered. We were surprised when he decided to advertise for a wife. He's been alone since... Judith hesitated. Well, it's not my story to tell. Irene's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't press. Would you like to come inside? I believe Martha has just made fresh coffee. Thank you, no. I should find Ezra before heading back. Business matter to discuss. Judith remounted her horse with practiced ease. Welcome to Montana Territory, Miss Hammond. I hope you find what you're looking for here. The words seemed sincere enough, but something in Judith's tone suggested she didn't expect Irene to last long at Whispering Pine. Good day, Mrs. Blackwood, Irene replied, returning to her laundry as the other woman rode off in the direction of the north pasture. Later, as Irene was preparing dinner, Martha joined her in the kitchen, moving more easily after her rest. I saw Judith Blackwood ride in earlier, the older woman commented, checking the stew Irene had prepared. Yes, she was looking for Mr. Sullivan. Something about business. Martha made a non-committal sound that spoke volumes. You don't approve of Mrs. Blackwood? Irene asked, intrigued. It's not my place to approve or disapprove, Martha replied diplomatically. Judith's been a neighbor for many years. She's a capable woman. But, Martha sighed, but she's had her eye on Ezra since her husband passed, and she's not subtle about it. Not that Ezra's encouraged her, mind you. Quite the opposite. I see. Irene wasn't sure why this information made her feel oddly relieved. She seemed formidable. That she is. Built up the Blackwood Ranch from near bankruptcy to one of the most successful operations in the county. Smart as a whip and knows the value of $1. Martha checked the rising bread. This looks perfect, dear. You have a good hand with dough. My mother taught me, Irene said, smiling at the memory. She said a woman should know how to make bread even if she never has to. It builds character. Wise woman, your mother. She was. Irene brushed flour from her apron. Martha, may I ask you something? Of course, dear. Why did Mr. Sullivan advertise for a wife if he's so reluctant to have one? Martha hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Ezra's a proud man. He wouldn't admit it, but he's lonely. This big house empty, except for me and him. He sees the other ranchers, with their families, children running about. I think he finally decided it was time, even if he's not entirely comfortable with the idea. He seemed shocked when he saw me, Irene observed, as if I wasn't at all what he expected. Martha looked uncomfortable. Well, your letters, they may have given a different impression. My letters I was honest about. Irene stopped, a suspicion forming. Martha, did you read my letters to Mr. Sullivan? The older woman's cheeks flushed. I did more than read them, dear. I wrote the replies. You wrote... Irene sat down abruptly at the kitchen table. Mr. Sullivan didn't write those letters. Any of them. Martha shook her head. Ezra can read and write just fine, better than most, actually. But he's not one for correspondence. When your first letter came, he asked me to handle it, said he didn't have time for flowery nonsense, as he put it. So all those questions about my background, my interests, my expectations, that was you? I'm afraid so. Ezra gave me the general requirements, healthy, hard-working, practical, but the rest was my doing. Martha looked genuinely contrite. I thought if I found him someone with a bit of education and refinement, someone who could appreciate this house and all it represents, well, I hoped it might bring back the Ezra I used to know. What do you mean? Martha sighed heavily. Ezra wasn't always so closed off. There was a time when he laughed, when he engaged with people, when he cared about more than just the ranch and the work. What changed him? That's his story to tell if he ever chooses to. Martha touched Irene's hand gently. I'm sorry for the deception, truly. But I'm not sorry you're here. This house needs someone like you, whether Ezra realizes it yet or not. Before Irene could respond, the back door opened and Diego entered, his expression urgent. Miss Hammond, he said, his accent thick with worry. You must come. There has been an accident. Bill Thompson, he is injured badly. Irene was on her feet instantly. What happened? The horse threw him against the fence. His arm it is broken, I think, and there is much blood. Where is he? They bring him to the bunkhouse now. Irene turned to Martha. Do you have medical supplies? Bandages, alcohol, clean cloths. In the pantry top shelf, the wooden box with the red cross. Martha was already moving to fetch it. There's laudanum in my room. Second drawer of the dresser. Bring it all to the bunkhouse, Irene instructed, following Diego out the door, and plenty of hot water. As she hurried across the yard, Irene felt a familiar calm descend the focus that had served her well in field hospitals and during the yellow fever epidemic. Her body might be failing her, but her mind and hands remained those of a nurse. At the bunkhouse, she found chaos. Bill Thompson lay on a narrow bunk, his face gray with pain, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. Blood soaked through his torn shirt from a deep gash across his chest. Sam and Tom were trying to keep him still, while Frank paced anxiously. Caleb stood by the door looking terrified. Ezra knelt beside the bunk, pressing a bandana against the worst of the bleeding. He looked up as Irene entered, his expression a mix of desperation and relief. He fell on the broken fence post, Ezra explained tersely. Arms broken bad, and the post tore him up. Irene moved to the bunk, automatically assessing the situation. I need space to work. Everyone back except Mr. Sullivan and Sam. Caleb, go help Martha with the supplies. To her surprise, the men obeyed without question. Ezra moved aside to give her access to the injured man, but stayed close. Bill, Irene said clearly, ensuring the injured man could focus on her. I'm going to help you, but it's going to hurt. Do you understand? Bill nodded weakly, his breath coming in pained gasps. The arm needs to be set before we can move him to the house, she told Ezra. It's a compound fracture. The bone has broken through the skin. If we move him as he is, we risk further damage and infection. You can set it, Ezra asked, doubt clear in his voice. I've done it before, Irene replied, not adding that it had been on battlefields and in field hospitals under far worse conditions. I'll need your strength to hold him still. Sam, when Martha brings the laudanum, give him a full dose. It won't take away the pain completely, but it will help. Martha arrived with the medical box and laudanum, followed by Caleb carrying a kettle of hot water. Irene worked quickly, cleaning her hands with alcohol before examining the broken arm more closely. Clean break, she murmured. That's good. Easier to set. She administered the laudanum herself, waiting for it to take effect before proceeding. As Bill's eyes grew unfocused and his breathing steadied, she nodded to Ezra. Hold him down. This will hurt him, despite the laudanum. Ezra gripped Bill's shoulders firmly. Sam took hold of his legs. Irene positioned herself at the broken arm, took a deep breath, and with one swift, practiced movement, pulled and twisted the bone back into alignment. Bill's scream was muffled by the laudanum, but his body arched in pain. Ezra's powerful hands kept him from moving too much, his own face tight with sympathetic agony. Done, Irene said, already reaching for splints and bandages from the medical box. Now, we need to immobilize it before moving him. She worked efficiently, cleaning the wound where the bone had broken the skin, applying a poultice of herbs from Martha's supplies, then splinting and bandaging the arm securely. The chest wound needs stitching, she said, turning her attention to the gash. It's deep, but clean. No signs of internal bleeding that I can see. You can stitch him up? Sam asked, clearly impressed. I can. Irene threaded a needle from the medical box. More laudanum first, though. This will be almost as painful as setting the bone. Throughout the procedure, Ezra remained silent, following Irene's instructions without question. His hands were steady, his assistance invaluable. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged Bill's chest, she sat back suddenly aware of her own exhaustion. He should be moved to the house where I can monitor him, she said. The bunkhouse is too drafty, and infection is the greatest danger now. We'll put him in the spare room, Ezra decided. It's on the ground floor, easier to access. With careful coordination, they transferred Bill to the house, settling him in a comfortable room that Irene hadn't seen during her earlier tour. Once he was situated, she checked his pulse and breathing. The laudanum will keep him comfortable for a few hours, she told Ezra. He'll need more when he wakes, and the bandages will need changing twice daily to prevent infection. Ezra nodded, his expression thoughtful. You handled that well. It wasn't quite praise, but it was the closest thing to approval he had offered since her arrival. Irene felt absurdly pleased. Thank you, she replied simply. I should check on dinner. The men will be hungry after all this excitement. As she turned to leave, Ezra spoke again. Miss Hammond. She paused at the door. Yes. You said you were stronger than you looked. His blue eyes met hers directly. It appears you were right. It wasn't an apology for his earlier dismissal, but in some ways, it was better. It was recognition, the beginning of respect. Irene inclined her head slightly. I rarely make claims I can't support Mr. Sullivan. As she headed back to the kitchen to salvage dinner, Irene felt a strange lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. For the first time since arriving at Whispering Pine, she felt as if she might actually find a place here, however briefly, before her time ran out. In the doorway of the sick room, Ezra watched her go, his expression unreadable to anyone who might have been observing. But there was something there that hadn't been present that morning, a spark of interest, perhaps even admiration, quickly hidden behind his customary reserve. The woman was not what he had expected. Not at all. Over the next week, Irene fell into the rhythm of life at Whispering Pine. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast, tended to Bill Thompson's injuries, managed the household chores, and gradually took over more of Martha's duties as she observed the older woman's increasing discomfort from arthritis. The ranch hands had accepted her presence with surprising ease, especially after her skilled handling of Bill's injuries. Young Caleb in particular seemed to have appointed himself her unofficial assistant, appearing whenever heavy lifting was required, or firewood needed replenishing. Only Ezra remained distant, though his outright hostility had given way to a wary observation. He watched her from across rooms, his expression unreadable. Occasionally she would catch him studying her with something like puzzlement, as if she were a complex equation he couldn't quite solve. On the seventh day after her arrival, Irene was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the late vegetables before the first frost. The October air carried a bite, and the mountains on the horizon wore a fresh dusting of snow. Winter was coming to Montana territory. Irene knelt beside a row of carrots, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. Despite the cold, she felt strangely content. The physical labor of the past week had exhausted her, leaving little energy for worry about her condition. There had been moments of weakness, a dizzy spell while hanging laundry, a coughing fit while sweeping the porch, but she had managed to hide the worst of them from the household. "Miss Hammond?" She looked up to find Ezra standing at the garden gate. He wore his customary work clothes, but his hat was in his hands. A small gesture of politeness she hadn't observed before. "Mr. Sullivan," she acknowledged, brushing soil from her skirt as she stood. "Is there something you need? Martha tells me you've taken over most of her duties." Irene nodded. "Her hands pain her greatly, especially in the mornings. I'm happy to help." "And Bill Thompson is improving?" "Yes, though he'll need at least 6 weeks before that arm is fully healed." She tilted her head slightly. "Was there something specific you wish to discuss, Mr. Sullivan?" Ezra shifted his weight, the closest thing to discomfort she had seen from him. "The preacher's in town. He'll be here tomorrow for Sunday service. We can make things official then, if you're still willing." The formal proposal was so lacking in romance or warmth that Irene almost laughed, but behind his stiff words she sensed genuine uncertainty, as if he truly expected her to have changed her mind about marrying him. "I am still willing," she replied simply. Relief flickered across his features before his usual reserve reasserted itself. "Good. That's good." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll let Martha know. She'll want to prepare something special for tomorrow." As he turned to go, Irene called after him, "Mr. Sullivan, may I ask you something?" He paused, looking back at her. "Why did you advertise for a wife?" The question had been gnawing at her since Martha's revelation about the letters. Ezra clearly hadn't been eager for a bride, certainly not one like her. What had driven him to this arrangement? His expression closed like a door slammed shut. "It seemed practical." "Practical?" she repeated, unable to keep a hint of disbelief from her voice. "This is a large operation. A household needs a woman's touch." He gestured vaguely at the house. "Martha's getting older. Can't manage everything herself anymore. So you wanted a housekeeper, not a wife." His jaw tightened. "I wanted someone capable of being both." "And you don't believe I'm capable?" It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I don't know what you're capable of yet." The frank admission surprised her. It wasn't a denial of her abilities, but neither was it a ringing endorsement. "I suppose that's fair," she conceded. "We're still strangers to each other." Something softened in his expression. "Yes, strangers." He hesitated, then added, "Though perhaps less so than a week ago." It was the closest thing to warmth he had offered her, and Irene found herself smiling despite herself. "Perhaps." He nodded once, as if concluding a business transaction, and strode away toward the barn. Irene returned to her harvest bemused by the encounter. Ezra Sullivan remained an enigma, a man who communicated primarily in grunts and terse sentences, yet possessed a house full of books. A man who had advertised for a wife but seemed disturbed by the prospect of actually having one. A man whose employees spoke of him with respect, bordering on reverence, but who kept everyone, including her, at arm's length. She placed another carrot in her basket, considering what Martha had told her. There was a time when he laughed, when he engaged with people. What had happened to transform that man into the closed-off figure who now stalked the halls of Whispering Pine? The answer, she suspected, lay in what Judith Blackwood had almost revealed and what Martha had been unwilling to discuss. Something in Ezra's past had wounded him deeply enough to change his fundamental nature. As a nurse, Irene had seen such transformations before. Men who returned from war shells of their former selves. Women who had lost children and could never smile again. Wounds of the spirit were often more devastating than wounds of the flesh, and infinitely harder to heal. "Miss Hammond." Caleb's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The young man was jogging toward her from the direction of the bunkhouse, his blonde hair catching the autumn sunlight. "Sam sent me to fetch you. Bill's in an awful state, fever's up, something fierce." Irene was on her feet instantly, medical instincts taking over. "How long has he been feverish?" "Started last night, but got worse this morning. He's talking nonsense now, calling out for his ma." "Infection," Irene muttered, hurrying toward the house. "I feared this might happen." In the sick room, she found Bill thrashing weakly on the bed, his face flushed with fever, his bandaged arms swollen and hot to the touch. Sam stood by the bed, his weathered face tight with worry. "Started early this morning," the foreman reported as Irene examined the patient. "Thought it might pass, but he's getting worse by the hour." Irene unwrapped the bandages on Bill's arm, revealing angry red flesh around the site where the bone had broken through the skin. The stitches were holding, but the surrounding tissue was inflamed and seeping. "I need clean bandages, alcohol hot water, and Martha's herb box," she instructed Caleb, who hovered anxiously by the door, "and more laudanum, he's going to need it." As Caleb hurried off, Sam asked, "Is it bad?" "Infection has set in," Irene confirmed. "But we've caught it early. With proper treatment, he should recover." "What kind of treatment?" "I'll need to open the wound, drain it, clean it thoroughly, and apply a poultice." She met Sam's concerned gaze directly. "It will be painful for him, but necessary." Sam nodded grimly. "Whatever you need to do. Bill's a good man, one of our best hands." When Caleb returned with the supplies, Irene set to work. She administered laudanum first, waiting for it to take effect, for proceeding with the grim task of reopening part of the wound. Bill groaned in pain despite the medication, but Sam and Caleb held him steady as Irene drained the infection, cleaned the wound with alcohol, and applied a poultice of Martha's herbs, a mixture she recognized as containing yarrow calendula and other medicinal plants. "He'll need constant monitoring," she told Sam as she rebandaged the arm. "The fever must be controlled and the wound cleaned regularly. I'll stay with him tonight." "You need rest yourself, ma'am," Sam protested gently. "You've been working from dawn to dusk every day this week." "I've managed with less sleep under more difficult conditions," Irene assured him, though in truth her own exhaustion was a constant companion these days. "Caleb can relieve me in the morning." By evening, Bill's fever had risen further. Irene bathed his face and chest with cool water, changed the poultice, and administered more laudanum when his pain grew too intense. Outside the sick room window, darkness fell, and the ranch grew quiet. The door opened around midnight, and Ezra entered, carrying a tray with coffee and a plate of sandwiches. "Martha thought you might need these," he said, setting the tray on a small table. "Thank you." Irene realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "That's very thoughtful." Ezra moved to the bed, looking down at Bill's flushed face. "How is he?" "The fever's still high, but the wound looks cleaner. If we can get him through the night, he should turn the corner by morning." Ezra nodded, then surprised her by pulling up a chair on the opposite side of the bed. "I'll sit with you for a while." "That's not necessary." I know it's not necessary, he interrupted, but Bill's been with me 5 years. He's a good worker and a loyal man. I'd like to stay. Irene nodded, understanding. This wasn't about her. It was about Ezra's sense of responsibility toward his men. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds Bill's labored breathing and the occasional crackle from the small fire in the grate. Irene sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth and the temporary burst of energy it provided. "You've done this before," Ezra observed, watching as she changed the cool cloth on Bill's forehead. "Sat up with the sick and injured." "Many times," she confirmed. "During the war and after." "Where did you serve?" "Field hospitals in Virginia and the Carolinas mostly. Then a yellow fever outbreak in South Carolina after the war ended." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Yellow fever, that's dangerous work." "Yes." She didn't elaborate on how the epidemic had claimed her family, leaving her alone and strangely immune. Some wounds were too personal to share with a man who remained largely a stranger. "Is that where you learned medicine?" "Some of it. I had training as a nurse before the war, but nothing compares to the education one receives in a field hospital during battle." Ezra's expression grew distant, as if her words had triggered memories of his own. "No," he said softly. "Nothing compares to that." The way he said it made Irene look at him more closely. "You served as well." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Union cavalry. Joined in '62 after Fort Donelson fell. Served until Appomattox." "You saw a great deal of fighting then." "More than I care to remember." Silence fell between them again, but it was different now, less strained, more contemplative. They shared something Irene realized. Both had witnessed the horrors of war, the suffering of men torn apart by bullets and shrapnel, the desperate fight to save lives against overwhelming odds. "Did you come west after the war?" she asked, changing the cloth on Bill's forehead again. "Not immediately. Went home to Illinois first." His expression closed again. "Came to Montana in '67. And your family has been here 3 generations, you said." "My grandfather came out in '32 when this was still contested territory. Built the first cabin, started running cattle. My father expanded the operation, built most of this house. I took over after he died in '75. It was the most he had spoken about himself since her arrival, and Irene found herself wanting to know more. "Your mother died when I was 12. Pneumonia." "I'm sorry." He shrugged as if the loss was too distant to still cause pain. "It was a long time ago." Bill stirred on the bed, mumbling incoherently. Irene checked his pulse, still rapid but slightly stronger than before. His fever seemed marginally lower as well. "I think he's improving," she told Ezra. "Good." He stood stretching subtly. "I should let you rest. Dawn comes early." "I'll be fine," Irene assured him. "This is familiar territory for me." Ezra paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You're not what I expected, Miss Hammond." "So I've been told." A faint smile, the first she had seen from him, touched his lips. "Good night." "Good night, Mr. Sullivan." After he left, Irene settled back in her chair, oddly energized by their brief conversation. For the first time, she felt as if she had glimpsed the man beneath the forbidding exterior, a man shaped by war and loss, just as she had been. Outside the window, a full moon rose over the pine forest, bathing the ranch in silver light. Irene watched it climb higher, marveling at the vastness of the Montana sky. Even if her time here was brief, moments like this made her journey worthwhile. The simple wooden church in Crow's Bend was filled to capacity that Sunday morning. Word had spread quickly that Ezra Sullivan's mail-order bride had arrived, and it seemed the entire community had turned out to witness the wedding. Irene stood at the back of the church beside Martha, acutely aware of the curious stares directed her way. She wore her best dress, a modest blue silk she had saved for special occasions, and Martha had helped arrange her dark hair in a simple but elegant style. "Don't mind them," Martha whispered, noting Irene's discomfort at being the center of attention. "They're just curious. Ezra's something of a local legend, and no one expected him to marry again." Again. The word caught Irene by surprise. So Ezra had been married before. This explained much about his reluctance and reserve. Before she could ask Martha for details, the preacher, a traveling minister named Reverend Collins, who served several small communities in the territory, called for everyone to be seated. Ezra, standing near the altar, in a clean black suit that transformed his appearance from rugged rancher to distinguished gentleman, caught Irene's eye across the church. His expression was solemn, but she detected a hint of nervousness in the way he clasped and unclasped his hands. The service proceeded with familiar hymns and prayers. Irene found comfort in the ritual, in the sense of community that filled the small church. When the time came for the wedding ceremony, she walked alone down the short aisle to join Ezra before the altar. There was no one to give her away, no family to witness her marriage. Only Martha, sitting in the front pew with tears in her eyes, represented anything close to family for either of them. The vows were simple and traditional. Irene spoke clearly, her voice steady as she promised to love, honor, and obey conventional words that took on a strange poignancy given the circumstances. Ezra's responses were equally firm, though he stumbled slightly over "to love" and "to cherish," as if the words themselves were foreign to his tongue. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a chaste kiss on Irene's lips, their first physical contact beyond a handshake. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, the kiss over almost before it began. Yet, Irene felt a curious flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her heart condition. Afterward, there was a reception at the town hall, a simple affair with punch, coffee, and cakes provided by the women of the community. Irene found herself surrounded by curious townspeople, all eager to meet Ezra Sullivan's new wife. "We were beginning to think Ezra would never marry again," confided Mrs. Peterson, the boarding house proprietor. "Not after what happened with Rebecca." "Rebecca?" Irene questioned, seizing the opportunity to learn more about her husband's past. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened. "Oh my, doesn't he talk about her? Well, I suppose it makes sense. It was all rather unfortunate." Before she could elaborate, Virginia Caldwell joined them, her husband Henry in tow. "Mrs. Sullivan," she greeted Irene warmly, the new title still strange to hear. "You look lovely today. Marriage agrees with you already." "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell, and please call me Irene." "Only if you call me Virginia." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "How are you settling in at Whispering Pine? I imagine it's quite an adjustment." "It's been interesting," Irene admitted, "but everyone has been very welcoming." She glanced across the room to where Ezra stood in conversation with several other ranchers, his posture stiff but not unwelcoming. "Everyone except Judith Blackwood, I'd wager," Virginia remarked, following Irene's gaze to where Judith stood nearby, elegant in a tailored burgundy dress that spoke of Eastern wealth and taste. "She's had her eye on Ezra since Robert passed." "So I've gathered," Irene replied diplomatically. "Judith's a formidable woman," Henry Caldwell commented. "Built up the Blackwood Ranch from near nothing after Robert died in debt. Smart businesswoman, but—" he shrugged eloquently. "But cold as a Montana winter," Virginia finished for him. Not that anyone would say so to her face. Across the room, Judith seemed to sense their attention. She raised her glass slightly in Irene's direction, her expression perfectly polite, but lacking warmth. Irene nodded in acknowledgement, feeling an odd sense of competition with the confident, successful woman. The reception continued with well wishes from the townspeople, many of whom seemed genuinely pleased to see Ezra married again. Irene noted that almost everyone referred to her as Ezra's new wife, reinforcing what she had learned, that she was, indeed, his second wife, though no one seemed inclined to tell her directly what had happened to the first. As the afternoon wore on, Irene found herself growing tired. The events of the past week, especially the night spent tending to Bill Thompson, who was now recovering steadily, had taken their toll. She made her way to a quiet corner, hoping for a moment's rest. "Tired already, Mrs. Sullivan?" Judith Blackwood's voice startled her. The older woman approached with 2 cups of punch, offering one to Irene. "The duties of a rancher's wife can be exhausting, especially for someone unused to the rigors of frontier life." Irene accepted the punch with a grateful nod. "I'm adapting, Mrs. Blackwood." "Judith, please." She sipped her punch, studying Irene over the rim of her cup. "You know, when I heard Ezra had sent for a bride, I was surprised. He's been adamant about remaining unmarried since Rebecca left." Left. Not died, then. Rebecca had left Ezra. "People change," Irene said noncommittally. "Some do." Judith's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ezra, in my experience, is not one of them. Once wounded, he retreats behind those walls of his and stays there. You seem to know my husband quite well. We've been neighbors for years and business partners of a sort. Our ranches share water rights to Pine Creek." Judith set down her empty cup. "I only mention Rebecca because, well, it might be helpful for you to understand what you're dealing with." "And what am I dealing with, in your opinion? A man who trusted once and paid dearly for it." Judith's voice softened slightly. "Rebecca was beautiful, vivacious, everything a man like Ezra needed to bring him out of his shell after the war. They seemed blissfully happy for nearly 2 years. Then she left him for a banker from Denver who was passing through, pregnant with Ezra's child, no less." Irene felt as if she'd been struck. His child, a boy, born 6 months after she left. "Ezra has never seen him." Judith shook her head. "It destroyed something in him. The Ezra Sullivan who exists now is just a shadow of the man he was before Rebecca's betrayal." "Why are you telling me this?" Irene asked, genuinely curious about Judith's motives. "Consider it a wedding gift. Knowledge is valuable out here as much as gold or water rights." Judith's expression was impossible to read. "I've watched Ezra retreat further into himself each year. Perhaps you'll succeed where others have failed and bring him back." With that enigmatic statement, Judith excused herself, leaving Irene to process this new information. A wife who had left him pregnant with his child. A son he had never seen. No wonder Ezra kept everyone at arm's length if this was the pain he carried. The ride back to Whispering Pine that evening was quiet. Ezra drove the wagon with his customary skill, while Irene sat beside him, lost in thought. Martha had remained in town to visit her sister, planning to return the following day, leaving the newlyweds alone for their first night as husband and wife. The awkwardness of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. As they approached the ranch, the sun setting behind the mountains cast long shadows across the land. The house looked welcoming with lamps already lit in the windows. Sam's doing, Irene guessed, a considerate gesture for the returning couple. Ezra helped her down from the wagon, his touch impersonal, but not unkind. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "Make yourself comfortable." Irene nodded and headed inside, uncertain what comfortable meant in this new context. Would he expect her to move her belongings to his room now that they were officially married? Or would their arrangement remain as platonic as it had been with her in the small room at the end of the hall? The house was quiet, the ranch hands likely giving them privacy on their wedding night. Irene moved through the familiar rooms, lighting additional lamps and stoking the fire in the main living room. She removed her hat and gloves, setting them aside, then paused, unsure what to do next. Her uncertainty was interrupted by a fit of coughing that doubled her over. She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, alarmed to see spots of blood when she pulled it away. The stress and exertion of the past week had taken a toll on her already weakened body. "Are you ill?" Ezra stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and wariness. She hadn't heard him enter. "It's nothing," she said automatically, tucking the handkerchief into her sleeve. "Just dust from the road." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking her arm and guiding her to a chair by the fire. "You're pale as a ghost. Sit." She obeyed, too weak to protest. Ezra poured a small measure of whiskey from a decanter on the sideboard and handed it to her. "Drink. It'll help." Irene sipped the fiery liquid, feeling it burn a path down her throat and spread warmth through her chest. "Thank you." Ezra remained standing, watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "How long have you been coughing blood?" The directness of the question startled her. Don't lie to me," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Not today. Not after we've stood before God and made vows to each other." The irony of his invoking their vows when their marriage was little more than a convenient arrangement wasn't lost on Irene. But he was right. There had been enough deception between them already. "Several months," she admitted. "It's why I left Boston." "What is it? Consumption?" "No." She took another sip of whiskey, gathering her courage. "My heart. There's a defect. I've had it since childhood, but it's worsened recently." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "How bad?" "Bad enough." She set the glass down, meeting his gaze directly. "The doctor in Boston gave me 6 months. Perhaps less." Ezra turned away abruptly, moving to the window where the last light of day was fading from the sky. His back was rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind him. "So you came here to die," he said, finally, his voice flat. "No," she replied with unexpected vehemence. "I came here to live, however briefly. To see something of the world beyond Boston. To matter to someone even in a practical way before the end." He turned back to face her, his expression now one of barely contained anger. "And you didn't think this was something I should know before we married? Would you have still married me if you had known?" His silence was answer enough. "That's why I didn't tell you," she said softly. "I knew you needed a healthy wife to help run your household, not a dying woman who might become a burden. So you lied." "Yes." She didn't try to justify it further. "I'm sorry for the deception, but not for coming here. These past days at Whispering Pine have been more meaningful than months of existing in Boston, waiting for the end." Ezra ran a hand through his hair, his anger seemingly giving way to resignation. "What am I supposed to do with this information? With you?" The bluntness of the question should have hurt, but Irene found his honesty refreshing after so much unspoken tension. "Nothing has to change. I'll continue as I have been, helping Martha, tending the household, earning my keep for whatever time I have left. When you can no longer work, when the sickness takes over completely, then I'll find a way not to be a burden." She held his gaze steadily. "I didn't come here seeking a caretaker, Mr. Sullivan." "Ezra," he corrected automatically. "You're my wife now, whatever the circumstances. You should use my given name. The concession, small as it was, surprised her. Ezra. She repeated the name, feeling strange on her tongue. He was silent for a long moment, seemingly deep in thought. Then he moved to the fireplace, bracing one arm against the mantel as he stared into the flames. My first wife left me, he said abruptly. For another man. She was carrying my child at the time. Irene remained silent, sensing that any interruption might cause him to retreat back behind his walls. I never saw the boy. He'd be 8 now. Ezra's voice was distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. Rebecca wrote once after he was born. Said he had my eyes. That was the last I heard from her. I'm sorry, Irene said softly. He shrugged, a gesture that failed to convey the indifference he clearly intended. It was a long time ago. Some wounds don't heal with time alone. He glanced at her sharply, as if surprised by her insight. No, he agreed after a moment. They don't. Another silence fell between them, but it was different now, charged with mutual understanding, with truths finally spoken aloud. It's late, Ezra said eventually. You should rest. Tomorrow will come early enough. Irene stood, recognizing the dismissal. Good night, then, and thank you for telling me about Rebecca. I know it wasn't easy. He nodded once, his gaze returning to the fire. Good night, Irene. As she walked down the hallway to her room, Irene felt oddly lighter, despite the difficult conversation. For the first time since her arrival, she and Ezra had spoken to each other with complete honesty. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was a beginning. In her small room, as she prepared for bed, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her seemed both familiar and strange, thinner than she had been in Boston, with shadows under her eyes, but also somehow more alive, more present in her own skin. 6 months to live, perhaps less. But tonight, for the first time, she found herself wondering, what if the doctor had been wrong? What if there were more days, more moments like this one ahead of her? It was a dangerous hope, but hope nonetheless. Life at Whispering Pine settled into a new rhythm in the weeks following the wedding. Irene continued her duties, managing the household, gradually taking over more of Martha's responsibilities as the older woman's arthritis worsened with the approaching winter. Bill Thompson recovered from his infection and returned to light duties, his arm still splinted, but healing well. Most surprising was the subtle shift in Ezra's behavior. He remained reserved, often absent from the house for long hours as he worked the ranch. But the coldness that had marked their early interactions had given way to a cautious civility. He began taking his evening meals with Irene in the dining room rather than in the kitchen, with the hands, and occasionally lingered afterward, reading by the fire while she mended or worked on household accounts. They rarely spoke of personal matters after their wedding night conversation, but the silence between them grew increasingly comfortable rather than strained. It was as if, having acknowledged the truths they each carried, they had reached an unspoken truce. One evening in early November, as the first serious snow of the season fell. Outside, Irene sat in the living room darning socks by lamplight. Ezra entered, stomping snow from his boots in the entryway before joining her by the fire. "Storm's getting worse," he reported, warming his hands by the flames. "Might be snowed in by morning." "I've prepared extra food just in case," Irene replied, setting aside her darning. "And Martha says the root cellar is well stocked for winter." Ezra nodded approvingly. "You've taken to ranch life better than I expected." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Sullivan?" Irene asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Ezra," he reminded her. "And yes, I suppose it is. He settled into the chair opposite hers, stretching his long legs toward the fire. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind howl outside and the crackle of the fire within. "When I was a boy," Ezra said suddenly, "my father would read aloud on nights like this. My mother would sew much as you're doing, and he'd read from Dickens or Scott, or sometimes Shakespeare." Irene looked up in surprise. It was the first time he had volunteered a childhood memory. "That sounds lovely." It was. His expression grew distant with memory. After she died, he still read sometimes, but it wasn't the same. The house felt empty without her. "You must have missed her terribly." "I did." He glanced at the bookcase that dominated one wall. "She's the one who taught me to love books. Said they were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. He rose and moved to the bookcase, running his fingers along the spines of the volumes. "What do you like to read, Irene?" The question, so ordinary in most households but extraordinary coming from him, caught her off guard. "All sorts of things. History, poetry, novels. I'm particularly fond of Jane Austen." "Austen?" he repeated, searching the shelves. "I believe my mother had a volume or two." He pulled out a book bound in faded green leather. "Pride and Prejudice. Would this suit?" Irene stared at him, uncomprehending for a moment. "Are you offering to read aloud?" "If you'd like." He seemed suddenly uncertain. "Or not, if you'd prefer to continue your work in silence." "No," she said quickly. "I'd like it very much." He returned to his chair, opened the book, and began to read. His voice, usually so terse and clipped in conversation, transformed as he read Austen's elegant prose. It was rich and resonant, rising and falling with the rhythm of the sentences, bringing the characters to life in the quiet room. Irene found herself transfixed, not just by the familiar story, but by this unexpected side of Ezra. As he read, the stern lines of his face softened, and occasionally when he reached a particularly witty passage, his mouth would curve in appreciation of Austen's humor. They continued this way for over an hour, the storm forgotten, as they immersed themselves in the world of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. When Ezra finally closed the book, marking their place with a ribbon, Irene felt as if she were waking from a pleasant dream. "Thank you," she said simply. "That was wonderful." He nodded, a hint of self-consciousness returning now that the spell of the book had been broken. "It's been a long time since I read aloud to anyone." "You read beautifully." She hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we could continue tomorrow evening." "I'd like that." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. From that night forward, reading aloud became a regular part of their evening routine. They finished Pride and Prejudice and moved on to other books, sometimes Irene's choices, sometimes Ezra's. Through Dickens and Eliot Whitman and Longfellow, they discovered a shared love of literature that bridged the gap between them more effectively than conversation ever had. During the day, they returned to their separate domains, Ezra to the work of the ranch, Irene to the management of the household. But the evenings by the fire became a sanctuary of sorts, a time when they could set aside the practical concerns of their arrangement and simply enjoy each other's company. As November deepened toward Thanksgiving, Irene noticed Judith Blackwood's visits to the ranch becoming more frequent. The widow always arrived with a plausible business reason, discussing water rights, comparing notes on cattle prices, proposing a joint purchase of breeding stock. But Irene couldn't help noticing how Judith's manner changed when she spoke to Ezra, her voice softening, her posture becoming more feminine despite her practical riding clothes. "She still has feelings for him," Martha observed one afternoon after Judith had departed. "Has for years, though Ezra's never given her any encouragement." She's a beautiful woman, Irene commented, trying to sound neutral, and successful in her own right. I can see why she might appeal to him. Martha snorted. Judith Blackwood is handsome enough, I'll grant you, and sharp as a tack when it comes to business, but she's cold inside, always calculating her advantage. Ezra needs warmth, not another ledger book. The observation startled Irene. You make it sound as if he and I— Aren't you? Martha asked shrewdly. I've seen the way you look at each other during those reading sessions. There's something growing between you whether you acknowledge it or not. Irene felt heat rise to her cheeks. It's not like that. We've reached an understanding, that's all. A friendship of sorts. If you say so, dear. Martha's tone made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. The truth was more complicated than Irene could explain even to herself. Yes, she had come to care for Ezra, his quiet strength, his hidden intelligence, even his gruff manner that concealed a deep capacity for feeling. But she was still dying, still marking time until her heart finally gave out. What right did she have to encourage deeper feelings, knowing she would only cause him pain when the inevitable happened? And yet each evening as they sat by the fire, their connection grew stronger. Sometimes catching him watching her over the top of his book, she glimpsed something in his eyes that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with her condition. The situation came to a head the night before Thanksgiving. Martha had gone to bed early, leaving Irene and Ezra alone in the living room. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in hushed white. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a golden glow that softened all edges. Ezra had been reading from Thoreau's Walden, but he closed the book mid-chapter, setting it aside with an air of decision. "Irene," he said, his voice unusually tentative, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." She set down her mending, instantly alert to the change in his tone. "Yes, our arrangement." He stared into the fire, avoiding her gaze. "It's been different than I expected." "Different? How?" "Better." The admission seemed to cost him some effort. "You've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone for good." "What's that?" "Life." He looked at her directly, now his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "Before you came, this place was just somewhere I slept between working days. Now it feels like a home again." Irene's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm glad." "The thing is," he continued, clearly struggling to find the right words, "our marriage has been in name only thus far, and that was the right choice given how we started. But I find myself wondering if perhaps, if you might consider—" He trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Are you asking if I would consider making our marriage real?" Irene asked gently. "Yes." The single word held a wealth of meaning. "Not out of obligation or our arrangement, but because I've come to care for you, Irene. More than I expected to, more than I thought I could care for anyone again." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way she had never seen from him before. Irene's heart raced, and for once it had nothing to do with her condition. "Ezra," she began, her voice soft, "I care for you too. These past weeks have been precious to me, but my situation hasn't changed. I'm still—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know what the doctor in Boston told you, but you've been here nearly 2 months now, working harder than most healthy women I've known, with no sign of decline. What if he was wrong? What if you have more time than you thought?" "And what if I don't?" she countered. "What if I allow myself, allow us both, to hope only to have that hope crushed when my heart finally fails? I couldn't bear to put you through that pain, Ezra, not after everything you've already endured." He rose from his chair and crossed to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his, the first time he had touched her since their brief wedding kiss. His hands were warm and calloused strong from years of ranch work. "Irene, listen to me. I've spent 8 years hiding from life, afraid to care too deeply about anyone or anything beyond this ranch. It took a dying woman to show me that I was already dead inside." His grip tightened on her hands. "Whatever time we have, whether it's 6 months or 6 years or more, I want to spend it truly living with you." Tears filled Irene's eyes, blurring his face before her. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted, "but I'm more afraid of missing what might be the best thing that's happened to me in years, because I was too cautious to reach for it." He released one of her hands to gently brush a tear from her cheek. The tender gesture undid her completely. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their wedding kiss, this one held nothing back. Ezra's arms came around her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. Irene felt something unfurl within her, a warmth, a joy, a sense of rightness that transcended all her fears and doubts. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," she replied simply. "For whatever time we have, yes." That night, Irene moved her belongings from the small room at the end of the hall to Ezra's bedroom, now their bedroom. As he helped her arrange her modest possessions alongside his, the simple domesticity of the act struck her as more intimate in some ways than the passion they had shared by the fire. Later, as she lay in his arms, her head resting on his chest, where she could hear the steady beat of his heart, Irene felt a peace she had not known since before the doctor's pronouncement in Boston. Whatever tomorrow might bring pain or joy, sickness or health tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping Whispering Pine Ranch in a blanket of pristine white, while inside 2 people who had expected to remain forever isolated found unexpected warmth in each other's embrace. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought changes to Whispering Pine that no one, least of all Irene, had anticipated. The transformation in Ezra was the most obvious. The taciturn, forbidding man who had greeted her at the stagecoach seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who smiled more readily, spoke more freely, and even occasionally laughed a rich, rusty sound as if long disused but not forgotten. The ranch hands noticed the change immediately. Sam commented on it to Irene one morning as she served coffee in the kitchen. "Never thought I'd see the day," the foreman said, shaking his head in wonder. "Boss was up at dawn singing, while he checked the new calves." "Singing what?" Irene asked, amused. "Some old war tune. Sounded like a dying moose, but the spirit was right." Sam's weathered face creased in a smile. "You've worked a miracle, Mrs. Sullivan." Irene demurred at such praise, but privately she marveled at the transformation herself. Ezra was still Ezra, strong-willed, occasionally brusque, intensely focused on the work of the ranch, but the hard edges had softened, the walls had begun to crumble. He touched her often now, casual gestures of affection that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. A hand at the small of her back as they passed in the hallway, fingers brushing hers as he accepted a cup of coffee, a kiss on the top of her head when he found her dozing by the fire. Their evenings remained their special time, but reading aloud had given way to more intimate conversations. Ezra spoke of his childhood on the ranch of his parents, of his time in the cavalry during the war. Irene shared stories of her family before the yellow fever took them, of her nursing experiences, of her dreams for a life she had thought forever out of reach. "I always wanted children," she admitted one snowy evening as they sat before the fire. "A house full of them with different personalities and talents. I imagined teaching them to read, to appreciate beauty, to be kind. Ezra's expression grew wistful. I've thought about my son often over the years, wondered what he's like, if he resembles me in any way, if Rebecca told him anything about me at all. Have you ever tried to find them? He shook his head. She made it clear in her letter that she wanted no contact. Said her new husband had adopted the boy, legally given him his name, that it would only confuse him to know about me. That seems cruel, Irene observed, to both of you. At the time, I was too angry to fight it. Later, I told myself it was better, this way, cleaner. But there are days. He trailed off, staring into the fire. There are days when I would give anything, just to see him, to know he's well. Irene squeezed his hand, offering silent comfort. These moments of vulnerability from Ezra still surprised her, though they were becoming more frequent as the barriers between them dissolved. Physically, Irene found herself feeling stronger than she had in months. The clean mountain air, the simple but nourishing food, and perhaps most importantly, the sense of purpose and belonging she had found at Whispering Pines seemed to have temporarily halted the progression of her condition. She still experienced occasional dizzy spells and fatigue, and her heart sometimes raced alarmingly after physical exertion, but the episodes were less frequent and severe than they had been in Boston. Martha observed the improvement with satisfaction. "I've always believed that happiness is the best medicine," she said one afternoon as they prepared for Christmas, stringing popcorn and cranberries for the small pine tree Ezra had cut and placed in the living room. "You're positively glowing these days, my dear." "I feel better than I have in a long time," Irene admitted, "though I try not to hope too much. The doctor was quite clear about the prognosis." "Doctors don't know everything," Martha declared with the confidence of one who had survived 8 decades relying primarily on home remedies. "The body has ways of healing itself that science hasn't discovered yet." Irene smiled at the older woman's certainty, but didn't argue. She had been a nurse too long to discount medical science entirely, but she couldn't deny the evidence of her own experience. Whatever the reason, she was stronger now than when she had arrived in Montana, and each day felt like a gift rather than another step toward an inevitable end. The only shadow on their happiness came from an unexpected source. In mid-December, Judith Blackwood arrived at Whispering Pine, unannounced, her expression grim as she dismounted from her horse. "Ezra," she called, seeing him emerge from the barn. "We need to talk, privately." Irene, watching from the kitchen window, saw Ezra's posture stiffen at Judith's tone. He gestured toward his office, a small room off the main house where he handled the ranch's business affairs, and followed Judith inside. They remained closeted there for over an hour. When they emerged, Ezra's face had regained the hard, closed expression Irene remembered from her first days at the ranch. Judith glanced toward the house, caught Irene watching, and offered a tight smile that held no warmth before mounting her horse and riding away. Ezra didn't come in for dinner that evening. Sam reported that he had ridden out to check the herd in the north pasture, though such a task was unnecessary and could have waited for daylight. "Is something wrong?" Irene asked the foreman. "Did Mrs. Blackwood bring bad news?" Sam shifted uncomfortably. "Not my place to say, ma'am. But there's been talk in town about the railroad coming through. Changes everything when the Iron Horse arrives." Irene waited up for Ezra, growing increasingly concerned as the hours passed and the temperature dropped. A winter storm was brewing, the wind picking up and carrying the promise of snow. Finally, close to midnight, she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. She met him at the door, relief washing over her at the sight of him safe, if covered in snow, and visibly exhausted. "Ezra, thank God. I was worried." He brushed past her without meeting her eyes. "No need. I know these lands better than the back of my hand." His tone was distant, reminding her painfully of their early interactions. She followed him into the living room, where he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and downed it in one swallow. "What's happened?" she asked directly. "What did Judith tell you?" He poured another drink before answering. "The railroad's coming through. They've already purchased land rights from most of the ranchers between here and Fort Benton." "But that's good news, isn't it? It will make it easier to get cattle to market, bring supplies in." "It would be good news if they weren't planning to run the tracks right through the heart of Whispering Pine." His voice was flat, controlled, but Irene could hear the anger simmering beneath. "Through the north pasture across Pine Creek, cutting the ranch in half." "Can they do that?" "Don't you have a say? They can and they will. The government gave them the right of eminent domain. They're offering to buy the land they need, but the price is insultingly low." He stared into his glass. "Judith came to warn me. The railroad representatives will be in Crow's Bend next week to finalize the deals with all the affected ranchers." "What will you do?" "Fight it, of course." He set down his glass with a sharp click. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I won't see it carved up for the convenience of Eastern businessmen who've never set foot in Montana. But if the law is on their side, there are ways to delay to make it costly for them. Legal challenges, appeals to the territorial governor. Judith's already engaged a lawyer in Helena who specializes in these matters." The mention of Judith sent a small chill through Irene. "She seems very invested in helping you." Ezra's gaze finally met hers, his expression softening slightly. "Judith's interests are purely practical. If the railroad cuts through, Whispering Pine Blackwood Ranch will be next. She's protecting her investment, nothing more." "I see." Irene hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Did you and Judith was there ever anything between you?" "No." His answer was immediate and firm. "She made her interest clear after Robert died, but I never encouraged it. Judith is a business associate, nothing more." Relief washed over Irene, followed immediately by guilt at her own insecurity. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." "Don't apologize." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You have a right to know. But understand this. Irene, what I feel for you, I have never felt for Judith or anyone else since Rebecca. You've brought me back to life when I thought that part of me was dead forever." The raw honesty in his voice dispelled her doubts. She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "We'll find a way through this, Ezra. Together." He wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Yes," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Together." Later that night, as they lay in bed with the wind howling outside their window, Ezra pulled her close against him, his touch more urgent than usual. Their lovemaking had a desperate quality, as if he were trying to anchor himself through physical connection, to reaffirm what they had found together in the face of this new threat. Afterward, as Ezra slept beside her, Irene remained awake, watching the snow fall beyond the window, and wondering what fresh challenges the railroad would bring to their newfound happiness. "Please," she whispered to whatever power might be listening, "just a little more time, for both of us." Outside, the storm intensified, blanketing Whispering Pine in pristine white, momentarily erasing all boundaries, a deceptive peace that would not last beyond the dawn. The railroad representatives arrived in Crow's Bend the following week, setting up temporary offices in the back room of the town's small hotel. Ezra rode into town early the morning they were scheduled to arrive, his expression grim but determined. Irene had offered to accompany him, but he had declined, saying this was a matter he needed to handle alone. "This is business." He had explained, his tone gentler than his words. Best if I present a united front with the other ranchers. Judith is meeting me there. She's gathered information from her lawyer that might help our case. So Irene remained at Whispering Pine trying to focus on her household duties while her mind remained fixed on what might be happening in town. Martha provided distraction with preparations for Christmas now just a week away, but even the festive activities couldn't entirely dispel Irene's sense of foreboding. By mid-afternoon, heavy snow began to fall again, further fueling her anxiety. Montana winters were notoriously harsh, and though Ezra knew the terrain well, blizzards could disorient even the most experienced riders. "He'll be fine," Martha reassured her, noting her frequent glances toward the window. Ezra could find his way home blindfolded in a whiteout. Been doing it since he was a boy. "I know," Irene replied, not entirely convinced. "It's just, he was so upset about the railroad. I'm worried about what he might do if they refuse to negotiate." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Ezra's always had a temper even as a child, but he's not reckless. Whatever he decides, it won't be without careful consideration." Evening fell with no sign of Ezra. Irene served dinner to the ranch hands, trying to maintain a calm facade despite her growing concern. Sam stayed behind after the others had returned to the bunkhouse, clearly sharing her worry. "I can ride into town to check on him if you'd like, ma'am," the foreman offered. "No, Sam. The snow's too heavy now, and we can't risk having both of you caught in the storm." Irene forced a smile. "As Martha says, Ezra knows these lands better than anyone. He'll come home when he can." It was nearly midnight when Irene, still waiting up in the living room, heard the sound of horses in the yard. She rushed to the door, relief flooding through her as Ezra stamped snow from his boots on the porch. But her relief turned to concern when she saw his face. There was a wildness in his eyes she had never seen before, a tightly coiled energy that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "What happened?" she asked, helping him remove his snow-covered coat. "They won't budge." His voice was taut with suppressed rage. "Offered me the same insulting price they're offering everyone else. When I refused, they said they'd proceed with condemnation proceedings, take the land by force, if necessary." "Oh, Ezra." She reached for his hand, but he moved past her into the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "They've already bought off most of the smaller ranchers. Jensen McPherson, even Old Man Dawson, all signed away their rights for a pittance because they're too afraid to fight. What about Judith? She's holding out too for now, but her lawyer says our chances of winning in court are slim." He ran a hand through his hair, still damp from snow. "The railroad has too much money, too much influence with the territorial government. There must be something we can do." "There is." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression now resolute. "I can make it so costly, so difficult for them to cross Whispering Pine that they'll be forced to find another route." "How?" "By refusing access to my land for their surveys, by challenging every legal document they file, by rallying the other ranchers who haven't yet signed to join me in resistance." His eyes blazed with determination. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, Irene. I won't surrender it without a fight." The intensity of his conviction was both admirable and alarming. Irene understood his attachment to Whispering Pine, had come to share it herself in the months she had lived there, but she also recognized the danger of standing against an entity as powerful as the railroad. "I support whatever decision you make," she said carefully, "but please consider all the consequences before you act. The railroad companies have crushed stronger opposition than a few Montana ranchers. And so I should just surrender, let them tear through the heart of Whispering Pine without a fight." "No." She moved closer to him, placing her hands on his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering beneath her palms. "I'm only asking that you consider all options before committing yourself to a battle you might not be able to win." Some of the tension seemed to drain from him at her touch. He covered her hands with his own, his expression softening. "I know you're right. But this place, it's more than just land to me, Irene. It's my heritage, my father's legacy, my future, our future, however long that might be." "I understand." And she did perhaps better than he realized. In the short time she had been at Whispering Pine, the ranch had become home in a way no place had been since her parents' house in Boston. "We'll find a solution together." He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile. "What would I do without you?" he murmured against her hair. "Let's hope you never have to find out," she replied, trying to make her tone light despite the shadow that still hung over them, the inescapable reality of her condition temporarily forgotten in the immediacy of the railroad threat, but never truly gone. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Whispering Pine. Irene was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of an approaching buggy. Looking out the window, she was surprised to see Judith Blackwood, who rarely visited so early and never in a buggy rather than on horseback. More surprising still was the man accompanying her, tall, distinguished, with silver at his temples, and an air of authority that marked him as someone accustomed to power. Ezra met them at the door, his expression guarded. Irene heard the murmur of voices in the entryway before Ezra led the visitors into the living room. Curious, she removed her apron and followed. "Irene," Ezra said as she entered, "this is Mr. James Montgomery from the Northern Pacific Railroad. Mr. Montgomery, my wife." The silver-haired man bowed slightly. "Mrs. Sullivan, a pleasure to meet you. I've heard much about you from Mrs. Blackwood." Irene nodded politely, though she wondered what exactly Judith might have said about her. "Welcome to Whispering Pine, Mr. Montgomery. Can I offer you coffee?" "That would be most welcome, thank you." As Irene went to fetch the coffee, she heard Montgomery begin to speak in measured, reasonable tones about the railroad's plans and the benefits it would bring to the territory. By the time she returned with a tray, the conversation had taken on a more contentious edge. "I understand your attachment to your land, Mr. Sullivan," Montgomery was saying, "but progress cannot be halted. The railroad will be built whether with your cooperation or despite your resistance." "Not through the heart of my ranch, it won't," Ezra replied, his voice controlled but firm. "I'm authorized to offer you 15% above the standard compensation rate." Montgomery continued, in recognition of the historical significance of Whispering Pine. "The land isn't for sale at any price, Mr. Montgomery." Judith, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Ezra, at least hear what he has to say. The railroad could bring tremendous opportunities to this region." "Opportunities for whom?" Ezra countered. "Eastern investors. The railroad company itself. What about the ranchers, whose livelihoods depend on intact grazing lands?" Montgomery accepted a cup of coffee from Irene with a nod of thanks. "Mr. Sullivan, I respect your passion, but I must be frank. The proposed route through your property is the most direct and cost-effective path for the railroad. While we would prefer to proceed with your cooperation, we have the legal authority to acquire the necessary right-of-way through eminent domain." "And I have the right to challenge that authority in court," Ezra replied evenly, "every step of the way." "Which would be costly and ultimately futile." Montgomery's tone remained reasonable, almost sympathetic. "But there may be a compromise that could satisfy both our interests." Ezra's eyebrows rose slightly. "What sort of compromise?" "An alternate route." Montgomery removed a map from his briefcase and spread it on the coffee table. Instead of cutting directly through your north pasture and across Pine Creek, we could shift the route to follow the eastern boundary of your property here." He traced a line with his finger. "It would require additional grading and a longer bridge across the creek, but it would leave the majority of your ranch intact." Irene saw Ezra's expression change as he studied the map. The alternative route would still impact Whispering Pine, but far less drastically than the original plan. "And what would this compromise cost me?" Ezra asked, his voice neutral. "We would need a wider right-of-way along the eastern border to accommodate the grade and access to Pine Creek for the bridge construction." Montgomery named a figure that, while still substantial, would affect less than a quarter of the land the original route would have required. "And why offer this alternative now? You made no mention of it yesterday." Montgomery glanced at Judith. Mrs. Blackwood was quite persuasive about the historical and personal significance of Whispering Pine. She convinced me to review the survey reports for possible alternatives. Irene looked at Judith with newfound respect. Despite her obvious interest in Ezra, the woman had used her influence to help protect his ranch. "I'll need time to consider this," Ezra said finally, "and to consult with my lawyer." "Of course." Montgomery gathered his map. "I'm in Crow's Bend until the end of the week. You can reach me at the hotel." He rose to leave, Judith following suit. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Sullivan, and for hearing me out, Mr. Sullivan." After they had departed, Ezra remained silent, staring thoughtfully into the fire. Irene sat beside him, waiting for him to process what had just occurred. "What do you think?" she asked finally. "I think Judith Blackwood has surprised me," he replied. "I expected her to side with the railroad entirely. It would be to her advantage if Whispering Pine were diminished. Perhaps she cares more about you than you've given her credit for." Ezra glanced at her sharply. "That's not what I meant. Judith is complicated. She always has an angle, a strategy. I'm just not sure what it is this time." "Does it matter if her intervention has given us a viable alternative?" Irene countered. "The eastern route would still allow the ranch to function as a whole." "Yes, it would." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "And fighting the railroad would be costly with no guarantee of success. This might be the best compromise available." "So you'll accept. I'll consider it. Carefully." He reached for her hand, his expression softening. "Whatever I decide, Irene, it will be with our future in mind, however long that might be." The reminder of her condition so casually referenced sent a small chill through her. In the drama surrounding the railroad, she had almost forgotten the shadow that still hung over them, her failing heart, the borrowed time she was living on. As if sensing her thoughts, Ezra drew her closer. "Every day with you is a gift," he said softly. "One I never expected to receive. Whatever happens with the railroad, with the ranch, none of it matters as much as that." The simple declaration warmed her more than the fire before them. Whatever time they had left, whether measured in months or years, they would face it together, just as they would face the railroad and whatever other challenges arose. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving Whispering Pine transformed beneath a blanket of pristine white. Like the ranch itself, Irene and Ezra's future remained unwritten, full of both uncertainty and possibility. For now, that was enough. Christmas arrived at Whispering Pine in a flurry of preparations. Martha, despite her arthritic hands, insisted on baking her traditional treats, gingerbread sugar cookies, and a rich fruit cake that had been soaking in brandy for weeks. Irene decorated the house with pine boughs, red ribbons, and handmade ornaments for the small tree in the living room. Even the ranch hands contributed to the festive atmosphere, Caleb carving wooden figures for the nativity scene, and Diego bringing traditional Mexican paper decorations he had crafted during the long winter evenings. Ezra, still preoccupied with the railroad situation, nevertheless made an effort to enter into the spirit of the season. He disappeared one afternoon and returned with a small cutter sleigh, announcing that they would attend the Christmas Eve service in town in style. "It belonged to my father," he explained as he polished the brass fittings in the barn. "He used to take my mother for rides on winter evenings. It's been stored in the back of the carriage house for years." Irene ran her hand along the sleek wooden runner. "It's beautiful, Ezra. Your mother must have loved it." "She did." His expression grew distant with memory. "I remember sitting between them as a boy, wrapped in buffalo robes, watching the stars overhead as we glided through the snow. She would sing carols, her voice rising like smoke in the cold air." The image of young Ezra, between his parents, secure in their love, warmed Irene's heart. "Thank you for sharing that with me." He glanced up, a smile softening his features. "I've been remembering more lately. Good things from the past that I'd packed away, I suppose. Since you came, they've been finding their way back to me." The simple admission touched her deeply. "I'm glad." On Christmas Eve, snow fell gently as Ezra hitched two of his finest horses to the sleigh. He had lined it with thick buffalo robes and heated bricks wrapped in flannel to keep their feet warm during the journey to town. Irene wore her best winter coat, a deep blue wool that Martha had helped her refashion from one of Ezra's mother's old garments found in the attic. "You look beautiful," Ezra said as he helped her into the sleigh, his admiration evident in his eyes. "Thank you." She settled beneath the robes, grateful for their warmth against the December chill. "It feels like a proper Christmas celebration." The ride to town was magical. Bells jingled on the horses' harnesses as they trotted through the snow-covered landscape, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. The moon, nearly full, cast a silver glow over the white fields, turning the world into a glittering wonderland. Ezra relaxed and almost carefree for the first time since the railroad representatives had arrived, pointed out familiar landmarks transformed by snow. He shared stories of Christmas celebrations from his childhood, of sledding parties and holiday feasts that had brought the entire community together. "The ranch was always full of people at Christmas when my parents were alive," he recalled. "Neighbors would ride for miles to join us. My mother played the piano, and everyone would sing carols and dance in the living room furniture pushed back against the walls." "It sounds wonderful," Irene said, picturing the scene. "Why did you stop the tradition?" His expression sobered. "After my father died, it didn't seem right to celebrate so exuberantly. And then, after Rebecca left," he shrugged. "I suppose I lost the heart for it." "Perhaps we could revive the tradition," Irene suggested. "On a smaller scale, of course. Invite some of the neighbors for New Year's." Ezra considered the idea, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that. Martha would be thrilled. She's been after me for years to entertain more." By the time they reached Crow's Bend, the streets were alive with activity. Lanterns hung from the buildings, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered boardwalks. Families made their way toward the small church, which shone like a beacon with candles in every window. Ezra tied the horses to a hitching post and helped Irene down from the sleigh. They joined the stream of people entering the church, exchanging greetings with townspeople who still regarded their marriage with curiosity. And inside the church was transformed. Evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorned the pews, and hundreds of candles created an atmosphere of reverent celebration. Irene and Ezra found seats near the back, next to Martha, who had come to town earlier to help with the decorations. The service was simple but moving. Reverend Collins spoke of hope, born in the darkest time of year of light, returning to a world grown cold. The congregation sang carols, their voices rising to the rafters in joyful harmony. As silent night filled the small church, Ezra took Irene's hand, his grip warm and steady. In that moment, surrounded by music and light, Irene felt a happiness so complete it brought tears to her eyes. After the service, they joined the gathering at the town hall where tables groaned under the weight of food, contributed by every family in the community. It was there that they encountered Judith Blackwood, elegant as always in a burgundy dress that set off her auburn hair. "Ezra, Irene," she greeted them with a polite nod. "Merry Christmas!" "Merry Christmas, Judith," Ezra replied. "I've been meaning to speak with you. Thank you for your intervention with Montgomery. The alternative route is acceptable." Judith's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've decided to accept, then?" "Yes, I met with him yesterday to discuss the terms." Ezra's arm slipped around Irene's waist in a gesture that felt both protective and proud. "We've negotiated a fair compensation for the land and additional considerations to minimize disruption to the ranch operations." "I'm pleased to hear it." Judith's smile seemed genuine, though Irene detected a flicker of something resignation in her eyes. "It's the sensible decision." "We have you to thank for making it possible," Irene said, offering an olive branch to the woman who had, whatever her motives, helped preserve the integrity of Whispering Pine. Judith acknowledged the comment with a graceful inclination of her head. It was the right thing to do. The original route would have been unnecessarily destructive. She glanced past them as if looking for someone. "If you'll excuse me, I promised the Petersons I would join them. Merry Christmas to you both." As she walked away, Irene felt a sudden surge of sympathy for the proud, solitary woman. "She's alone tonight," she murmured to Ezra. "On Christmas Eve." "Judith has chosen her path," Ezra replied, though without rancor. "She values independence above all else. Still, it must be difficult." Ezra studied her face, his expression softening. "You have a generous heart, Irene Sullivan." The use of her married name, still somewhat novel, brought a smile to her lips. "I'm simply grateful for what I have, especially tonight." They returned to Whispering Pine late, the horses' hooves muffled by the thick snow as they approached the ranch. The house welcomed them with windows aglow, Martha having returned ahead of them to prepare a late supper. After the meal, they gathered in the living room where presents waited beneath the small tree. The exchange was simple but heartfelt. A new scarf Martha had knitted for Ezra, despite her painful hands, leather gloves Ezra had commissioned from the town's saddler for Irene, a shawl of soft alpaca wool Irene had ordered from a catalog for Martha. Ezra's gift to Irene, saved for last, was a small box wrapped in silver paper. Inside she found a locket of delicate gold filigree. "It was my mother's," Ezra explained as she lifted it from the box. "My father gave it to her on their first Christmas together." "Ezra, I can't. It's too precious." "I want you to have it," he insisted gently. "She would have wanted you to have it too." Tears welled in Irene's eyes as he fastened the locket around her neck. The simple gesture represented more than just a gift. It was an acknowledgement of her place in his life, in his family's legacy. "I have something for you as well," she said when she had composed herself, "though it's not quite so grand." She retrieved a small package from beneath the tree and handed it to him. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather, its pages blank, except for an inscription on the first leaf, for the stories yet to be told. "With all my love, Irene." "I thought—" She hesitated suddenly, uncertain. "You've been remembering more of your past lately, the good parts. I thought perhaps you might want to preserve those memories and create new ones." Ezra ran his fingers over the leather binding, his expression thoughtful. "No one has given me a more perfect gift," he said finally, his voice husky with emotion. "Thank you." Later, as they lay together in the warmth of their bed, while winter winds howled outside, Irene felt a contentment so profound it seemed to transcend her physical condition. Whatever the future held, the railroad's arrival, the progression of her illness, this moment, this Christmas, was a gift beyond price. Ezra's arm tightened around her as if he sensed her thoughts. "Merry Christmas, Irene," he murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered back, the endearment still new enough to bring a flutter to her heart. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Whispering Pine in pristine white nature's own Christmas gift to the Montana landscape. January brought a bitter cold snap that tested even the hardiest Montana residents. Temperatures plunged well below zero, freezing Pine Creek solid and creating snowdrifts taller than a man. The ranch hands worked in short shifts, rotating frequently to avoid frostbite, as they tended to the cattle huddled in sheltered draws and fed the horses in the relative warmth of the barn. Irene kept the house fires burning constantly, worried about Martha, whose arthritis had worsened considerably with the cold. The older woman spent most days in a chair by the kitchen stove, directing Irene in the preparation of meals, but unable to participate as she once had. "I feel so useless," Martha lamented one particularly bitter afternoon as Irene kneaded bread dough at the kitchen table. "Sitting here like a useless lump while you do all the work." "Nonsense," Irene replied firmly. "Your knowledge is invaluable. I'd never have mastered half the household tasks without your guidance." She shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise. "Besides, you've earned a rest after all your years of service to the Sullivan family." Martha snorted, but looked pleased by the reassurance. "Rest is for the grave, not for old women with work still to do." Her gnarled hands worked slowly at a piece of mending in her lap. "Though I admit these old bones appreciate the warmth of the fire more than they used to." Irene wiped flour from her hands and poured them both cups of tea. "Ezra mentioned that your sister in town has been asking you to consider moving in with her. Have you given it any thought?" Martha's expression grew guarded. "Did he now? And what else did he say about it?" "Only that he thought it might be easier on you, especially during the winter months." Irene sat across from Martha. "The ride to town would be difficult in this weather, but perhaps when spring comes—" "This is my home," Martha said firmly. "Has been for 40 years since I came as a young widow to help Ezra's mother with the household. I've seen Ezra grow from a boy to a man. Watched him suffer through the war, through Rebecca's betrayal, through the long years of solitude after." Her faded eyes fixed on Irene with unexpected intensity. "And now I've seen him come back to life because of you. I won't leave until I know." She trailed off, but Irene understood the unspoken concern. Martha was waiting to see if Irene's health would hold, if the happiness she had brought to Whispering Pine would endure or be cut tragically short. "I'm stronger than I was in Boston," Irene said gently. "The doctor there may have been mistaken about the progression of my condition." "From your lips to God's ears," Martha replied, her expression softening. "You've been a blessing to this house, Irene Sullivan. To Ezra, of course, but to me as well. Having a young woman about the place again, someone to teach and talk with. It's given these last years meaning." Touched by the older woman's words, Irene reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "The blessing has been mutual, Martha. You've made me feel welcome from the first day when Ezra—" She smiled at the memory. "When Ezra was less than enthusiastic about my arrival." Martha chuckled. "That's putting it mildly. I've never seen a man more determined to be unhappy than Ezra was that day. And now, look at him, smiling, laughing, living again. It's nothing short of a miracle. Love can work miracles, Irene said softly, almost to herself. Indeed, it can, Martha agreed. Indeed, it can. The cold snap continued for 2 weeks, isolating Whispering Pine even more than usual. No visitors ventured the treacherous roads to the ranch, and trips to town were limited to absolute necessities. Ezra spent long hours outdoors, with the men returning each evening exhausted but satisfied that the cattle were weathering the brutal conditions as well as could be expected. Irene took advantage of the enforced seclusion to make progress on projects she had been planning since before Christmas. Curtains for the living room windows, a quilt for the master bedroom, and most ambitiously, a surprise for Ezra. While he was out with the herd one afternoon, she ventured into the attic, a space she had not yet explored fully. Among the trunks and boxes of Sullivan family possessions, she found what she was looking for: an old upright piano draped in a dust cloth and clearly untouched for years. With Caleb's help, sworn to secrecy, she had the instrument moved to the living room and positioned where Ezra's mother's piano had once stood, according to Martha. A piano tuner from town, brought to the ranch under the pretense of delivering supplies, worked for hours to restore the instrument to playable condition. When Ezra returned that evening, snow crusted on his beard and exhaustion evident in every line of his body, he stopped dead in the doorway of the living room, staring at the piano as if he had seen a ghost. "Surprise," Irene said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Martha told me your mother used to play that music was always part of Christmas at Whispering Pine. I thought, perhaps, and we might restore that tradition." For a long moment Ezra said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he crossed to the piano and ran his fingers lightly over the polished wood. "I had forgotten it was still here," he said, his voice hushed. "After she died, my father closed the lid and never opened it again. Eventually, he had it moved to the attic. Said the sight of it without her to play was too painful." "I'm sorry," Irene said, suddenly uncertain. "If it brings back difficult memories, we can—" "No." Ezra turned to her, and to her relief she saw not pain but wonder in his eyes. "It's perfect." She would have been pleased to see it in this room again, to know that music had returned to Whispering Pine. He lifted the lid and pressed a key, the clear note hanging in the air between them. "Do you play?" "A little," Irene admitted. "I had lessons as a girl, though I'm terribly out of practice." "Will you play something now for me?" The request, so simple yet so laden with emotion, caught Irene by surprise. "Of course." She settled on the bench, flexing her fingers nervously before placing them on the keys. The first notes were hesitant, uncertain, but gradually her confidence returned as she played a simple melody she had learned in childhood, "Green Sleeves," its haunting tune filling the room with bitter-sweet beauty. When she finished, she looked up to find Ezra watching her with an expression of such tender appreciation that it took her breath away. "That was my mother's favorite," he said softly. "How could you have known?" "I didn't," Irene replied, equally moved by the coincidence. "It's just one of the few pieces I still remember." He came to sit beside her on the bench, their shoulders touching. "Thank you for this gift, Irene, for bringing music back to this house." In response, she began to play again this time, a Christmas carol that seemed fitting, despite the season having passed. "What Child Is This?" set to the same Green Sleeves melody. To her delight, Ezra began to sing, his deep voice untrained but true, carrying the ancient words with quiet dignity. They spent the evening that way, exploring the piano's possibilities together, Irene playing the simple tunes she remembered, while Ezra sometimes sang, sometimes simply listened. Martha joined them later, her face alight with memories as she requested songs from years past. It was a moment of pure joy, untouched by concerns about the railroad's impending arrival, or Irene's health, or the brutal winter outside. Just three people connected by music and shared affection, creating warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the grate. As January gave way to February, the temperature gradually rose to more bearable levels. The railroad representatives returned to Crow's Bend to finalize arrangements with the affected ranchers. Ezra rode into town several times for meetings, returning with updates on the plans for construction scheduled to begin in the spring. They've agreed to build a proper crossing where the tracks intersect with our main cattle trail, he reported one evening, and they'll compensate us for any cattle lost during the construction period. That's good news, Irene said, pleased to see him approaching the situation with pragmatism rather than resentment. Will the bridge over Pine Creek affect our water access? Minimally. They've designed it to have minimal impact on the water flow. Ezra spread the latest plans on the dining room table for her to see. And they've moved the route another 100 yards east, further from the main grazing lands. Irene studied the drawings, impressed by the concessions Ezra had negotiated. You've done well, Ezra. This is a far better outcome than it might have been. Judith deserves some of the credit, he acknowledged. Her lawyer found precedents that strengthened our negotiating position. Speaking of Judith, Irene said carefully, Martha mentioned she's planning a dinner party next week. She's invited us along with several other ranchers and the railroad executives. Ezra groaned. Judith and her social ambitions. She's been trying to establish herself as the social leader of the county since Robert died. I think we should go, Irene said. It would be good to meet the other ranchers affected by the railroad to present a united front. You're right, of course. He folded the plans and set them aside. Though I warn you, Judith's parties tend to be elaborate affairs meant to impress Eastern visitors with her sophistication. I'm from Boston, Irene reminded him with a smile. I'm familiar with social pretensions. The dinner party at Blackwood Ranch the following week proved Ezra's description accurate. Judith had spared no expense importing delicacies from Denver, hiring extra servants and displaying her finest silver and china. The guests included not only local ranchers, but several railroad executives and their wives, as well as the mayor of Crow's Bend and his family. Irene, wearing her best dress, a deep green silk that Martha had helped her alter from one of Ezra's mother's gowns, felt somewhat out of place amid such ostentation. But she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had seen her through far more challenging situations, and was pleased to find herself welcomed warmly by most of the guests. James Montgomery, the railroad representative who had visited Whispering Pine, approached her during the pre-dinner gathering. Mrs. Sullivan, a pleasure to see you again. You're looking well. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. Montana agrees with me, it seems. Indeed. He lowered his voice slightly. I wanted to express my appreciation for your influence on your husband. His cooperation has made our work considerably easier. Ezra makes his own decisions, Mr. Montgomery, Irene replied evenly. I merely encouraged him to consider all options before committing to a course of action. A valuable service nonetheless. Montgomery glanced across the room to where Ezra stood in conversation with several other ranchers. He's well respected in this community. Where he leads, others follow. Before Irene could respond, Judith appeared at Montgomery's elbow. I see you've found our newest resident, James. Irene has made quite an impression since her arrival last fall. So I gather, Montgomery replied with a polite smile. Mrs. Sullivan was just explaining her husband's change of heart regarding our right-of-way. Ezra has always been reasonable when presented with facts, rather than threats. Judith observed her tone just shy of reproachful, something the railroad might have considered from the beginning. Montgomery accepted the mild rebuke with grace. A fair point, Mrs. Blackwood. We're learning that the Montana approach requires more personal consideration than our usual methods. Indeed. Judith turned to Irene. I must steal you away, my dear. There are several people who have been asking to meet Ezra Sullivan's new wife. As Judith led her through the crowded room making introductions to various local dignitaries, Irene observed the older woman with new appreciation. Behind the social ambition Ezra had described, there was genuine intelligence and strength of character. Judith had carved out a place for herself in a world dominated by men running her ranch successfully while maintaining the social graces expected of a woman of her position. You've created a beautiful home, Irene commented when they had a moment alone. It must have been challenging to establish yourself after your husband's passing. Judith's expression flickered with surprise at the personal observation. It was difficult, she admitted. Robert left substantial debts, and many people expected me to sell the ranch and return east. But this is my home now. I couldn't imagine leaving. I understand completely, Irene said sincerely. I've only been at Whispering Pine a few months, but already it feels more like home than anywhere I've lived before. Something like wistfulness passed across Judith's features. You're fortunate, Irene, to find both a home and a partnership that suits you. Yes, Irene agreed softly. I am very fortunate. Dinner was announced, interrupting the moment of unexpected connection between the two women. Ezra appeared at Irene's side, offering his arm to escort her to the dining room. Having a good time? He asked as they followed the other guests. Better than I expected, she admitted. Judith is not quite what I anticipated. How so? More vulnerable, more human, or... Irene glanced back at their hostess, now directing guests to their seats with practiced grace. I think perhaps we have more in common than I realized. Ezra considered this, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps you do. You're both strong women who've faced significant challenges, just in very different ways. The observation, so perceptive and free from jealousy, reminded Irene again of how far Ezra had come from the closed-off man who had greeted her at the stagecoach months before. The evening proceeded pleasantly, with excellent food and lively conversation. Irene found herself engaged in discussion with the mayor's wife about the possibility of establishing a proper school in Crow's Bend, while Ezra and the other ranchers debated the potential economic impact of the railroad's arrival. It was late when they finally departed for Whispering Pine, the night clear and cold, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. In the sleigh, wrapped in buffalo robes against the chill, Irene leaned against Ezra's solid warmth. I'm glad we went, she said, drowsy from the rich food and unaccustomed socializing. It was good to see the community coming together despite the initial conflicts over the railroad. You were the belle of the ball, Ezra observed, a smile in his voice. Everyone was impressed by Ezra Sullivan's mysterious Eastern bride. Hardly mysterious, Irene protested with a laugh. Just a former nurse who happened to answer an advertisement. You're much more than that, Irene Sullivan. Ezra's tone grew serious. You've transformed Whispering Pine, transformed me. I scarcely recognized the man I was before you arrived. We've transformed each other, she corrected gently. I'm not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach either. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the jingle of the harness bells and the whisper of the runners on snow. The moon cast long shadows across the white landscape, creating a scene of ethereal beauty. I've been thinking, Ezra said eventually, about what you said regarding reviving the tradition of gatherings at Whispering Pine. Yes, perhaps we could host something in the spring, after the snow melts, but before the railroad construction begins in earnest. A celebration of sorts. That sounds wonderful, Irene said, warming to the idea. We could invite the neighbors, have music now that the piano is restored. And perhaps, Ezra continued, a hint of nervousness in his voice, we could make it a double celebration. Of spring's arrival and of our marriage, a proper celebration. This time, not just the simple ceremony we had. Irene lifted her head to look at him, touched by the suggestion. A renewal of vows. After only a few months. A renewal of vows, yes, but also an affirmation of what we've found together since then. His eyes, reflecting the starlight, held hers with unusual intensity. When we married, it was an arrangement of convenience for both of us. Now it's something else entirely. Something wonderful, Irene murmured, her heart full. Yes? He bent to kiss her, the sleigh slowing as he momentarily neglected the reins. Something I never expected to find again. Something worth celebrating properly. The idea took root, giving them a project to focus on through the remaining winter months. Martha, delighted by the plan, threw herself into preparations, despite her arthritis, making lists of necessary supplies and suggesting guests to invite. February passed in a blur of domestic activity, with Irene dividing her time between household duties and preparations for the spring celebration. She found herself humming as she worked, playing the piano in the evenings, and generally feeling more energetic than she had in months. There were still occasional reminders of her condition, a racing pulse after climbing the stairs too quickly, shortness of breath on particularly cold mornings, a dizzy spell that forced her to sit down while preparing dinner one evening. But these episodes were less frequent and severe than they had been in Boston, reinforcing her hope that the doctor's dire prognosis might have been overstated. Ezra noticed the improvement as well, though he was careful not to make too much of it, as if afraid that acknowledging her better health might somehow jinx it. But she caught him watching her sometimes with a cautious optimism in his eyes that matched her own growing hope. As February gave way to March, the first signs of spring began to appear at Whispering Pine. The days grew longer, the sun stronger. Snow still covered the ground, but it had a different quality now, heavier, wetter, ready to yield to the changing season. Chickadees and nuthatches appeared at the bird feeder outside the kitchen window, and one particularly warm afternoon, Irene spotted a robin on a bare branch, the traditional harbinger of spring. It's early yet, Martha cautioned when Irene excitedly reported the sighting. We'll have more snow before winter's truly done with us. March is a fickle month in Montana. Her prediction proved accurate. Mid-March brought a severe storm that dumped nearly 2 feet of fresh snow on the ranch and surrounding countryside. The temperature plummeted, and howling winds created drifts that blocked doors and windows. Ezra and the hands worked tirelessly to keep paths clear between the buildings and to ensure the livestock had access to feed and water. Irene kept the home fires burning, prepared hot meals for the men when they came in half-frozen from their labors, and helped Martha, whose arthritis had flared painfully with the weather change. On the third day of the storm, as Irene was preparing a stew for dinner, Caleb burst into the kitchen, snow coating his clothes and panic in his young face. "Mrs. Sullivan, come quick. It's the boss, he's hurt." Irene's heart seemed to stop. "What happened? Where is he?" "In the barn. A beam came down the weight of the snow, hit him on the head and shoulder. Sam sent me to fetch you." Irene was already reaching for her coat and medical bag, which she kept ready for emergencies. "How bad is it?" "He's conscious, but there's blood, a lot of blood. And his shoulder looks wrong somehow. Tell Sam I'm coming, and have Diego prepare a room downstairs, the blue bedroom. We'll need to move Ezra there once I've stabilized him." As Caleb rushed back to the barn, Irene quickly gathered additional supplies: clean cloths, alcohol bandages, her precious bottle of laudanum. Her medical training took over, pushing fear aside as she focused on what needed to be done. "I'm coming with you," Martha insisted, struggling to rise from her chair by the fire. "No, Martha, your hands won't allow it, and I need you here to prepare the bedroom." Irene's tone brooked no argument. "Heat water, gather all the clean linens we have, and make sure there's a fire laid in the blue room. That will help more than anything." Reluctantly, Martha nodded, recognizing the practical wisdom in Irene's instructions. The journey to the barn, normally a matter of minutes, seemed to take an eternity, as Irene struggled through knee-deep snow against the driving wind. By the time she reached the large double doors, she was gasping for breath, her heart racing dangerously. She paused just long enough to compose herself before entering. The scene inside was chaotic. A massive beam had indeed fallen from the roof, bringing with it a cascade of snow and ice. The men had cleared most of the debris, and Ezra lay on a makeshift pallet of hay, his face alarmingly pale beneath a mask of blood from a gash on his temple. Sam knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to the wound, while Diego and the other hands worked to secure the damaged section of roof. "Irene," Ezra said, as she approached, his voice strained but conscious. "It's not as bad as it looks." "Let me be the judge of that," she replied, setting down her bag and removing her snow-covered coat. She turned to Sam. "What happened exactly?" Weight of the snow weakened the beam. Ezra was directly beneath when it gave way. Sam's weathered face was grim. "Hit him on the head first, then fell across his shoulder. We got it off him right away, but the damage was already done." Irene finished kneeling beside Ezra to examine him. The head wound, while bloody, appeared relatively superficial. Scalp wounds always bled profusely. More concerning was his left shoulder, which lay at an unnatural angle. The shoulder's dislocated, possibly fractured as well. Ezra grimaced. "Feels like it's on fire." "I need to examine you properly, and this isn't the place." She looked up at Sam. "Can you and the men carry him to the house? We've prepared the blue bedroom on the ground floor." "Of course, ma'am." Sam signaled to Caleb and Bill Thompson, whose arm had healed well from its earlier break. "Carefully now, boys. Use that door as a stretcher." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from a stable door, placing blankets over it before gently transferring Ezra onto it. He stifled a groan as the movement jostled his injured shoulder. "Laudanum first," Irene decided, opening her bag and measuring a dose of the pain-killing tincture. "This will help with the pain during the move." Ezra accepted the medicine without protest, a sign of how much pain he must be in. As they waited for it to take effect, Irene cleaned the head wound enough to confirm her initial assessment: painful and messy, but not life-threatening. "Ready?" she asked after a few minutes, noting Ezra's features had relaxed slightly as the laudanum began to work. "As I'll ever be," he replied, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace. The journey to the house was slow and careful, the men struggling to keep the stretcher level as they navigated through the snow. Inside, Martha had prepared the blue bedroom as instructed, with a fire blazing in the grate and clean linens on the bed. Once Ezra was settled on the bed, Irene took charge. "I need to examine him thoroughly now. Martha, stay if you wish, but the rest of you please wait outside. I'll call if I need assistance." The men filed out reluctantly, concern for their boss evident in their faces. Martha remained, her arthritic hands busy preparing bandages and hot water, despite the pain it must have caused her. Irene worked methodically, first cleaning and stitching the head wound, which looked worse than it was, a 3-inch gash that required 7 neat stitches. She checked Ezra's pupils and asked him simple questions to assess his mental state, relieved to find him alert and oriented despite the blow to his head. The shoulder was a more serious matter. After cutting away his shirt, Irene could see the joint was indeed dislocated, the bone visibly out of its socket. Bruising had already begun to spread across his chest and back, suggesting possible fractures as well. "I need to set the shoulder," she told Ezra, who watched her work through pain-glazed eyes. "It will hurt even with the laudanum." "Do what you must," he replied, his trust in her evident despite his suffering. Irene turned to Martha. "I'll need Sam and Diego to help hold him still. This will take considerable strength." When the men returned, Irene explained precisely what needed to be done. "I'll manipulate the joint back into place, but I need you to hold him firmly. He may fight against the pain, even with the medication." Sam positioned himself at Ezra's good side, ready to brace his body, while Diego took hold of his legs. Irene placed her hands on the injured shoulder, feeling for the displaced bone. "On 3, she instructed. 1, 2, 3, with a swift, practiced movement, she manipulated the joint, rotating and pulling until she felt the satisfying click of the bone returning to its socket. Ezra's body went rigid, a strangled cry escaping him despite his obvious attempt to remain stoic. Then he sagged back against the pillows, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's done," Irene assured him quickly, checking the repositioned joint. "The worst is over." She worked for another hour, binding the shoulder immobile against his chest to allow it to heal, checking for broken ribs, finding 2 that were cracked but not displaced, and treating the various cuts and bruises that covered his body. Throughout it all, Ezra remained conscious, his blue eyes following her movements with a mixture of pain and something else, pride, perhaps, or wonder at her competence in this crisis. When she had finished, she administered another dose of laudanum to help him rest. As the medicine took effect, he caught her hand in his good one. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice slurring slightly from the medication. "My nurse, my wife, my Irene." "Rest now," she replied softly, brushing damp hair back from his forehead. "I'll be right here." As promised, she remained by his bedside through the night, dozing occasionally in the chair, but waking at his slightest movement. Martha brought food and fresh tea, but Irene barely touched either her attention, focused entirely on monitoring Ezra's condition. By morning, his fever had risen, an expected response to the trauma, but concerning nonetheless. Irene bathed his face and chest with cool water, changed his bandages, and administered willow bark tea for both the fever and pain. Sam came to check on his boss at dawn, his weathered face grave with worry. "How is he, ma'am?" "Holding his own," Irene replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The fever's to be expected after such an injury. The next day or 2 will tell us more." "The men and I will manage the ranch," Sam assured her. "You just focus on getting the boss well again." For 3 days, Ezra's condition remained precarious. The fever rose and fell, sometimes leaving him delirious, calling out for people long gone, his mother, his father, even his ex-wife, Rebecca. During lucid moments, he seemed embarrassed by his weakness, apologizing for being a burden. "You are never a burden," Irene told him, firmly spooning broth into his mouth during one such interval. "Never." On the 4th day, the fever broke at last. Irene, who had barely slept since the accident, was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she felt a gentle touch on her hand. She opened her eyes to find Ezra watching her, his gaze clear for the first time in days. "You look terrible," he said, his voice weak but teasing. A laugh that was half-sob escaped her. "Thank you very much. And here I thought married men were supposed to find their wives beautiful at all times. Beautiful, yes, but also exhausted." His expression grew serious. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Not long," she lied, straightening in the chair. "Liar," he said fondly. Sam told me you haven't left my side for more than a few minutes since the accident, that you've barely slept or eaten. Well, Sam talks too much, Irene muttered, but without heat. How do you feel? Like I was kicked by a mule, then trampled by the entire herd. He attempted to shift position, wincing as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to your own hard head, more like, she countered, helping him adjust the pillows. The beam could have done much worse damage. My guardian angel must have been watching over me. He captured her hand again, his grip weak but intentional. Or perhaps she was sitting right beside me all along. The simple declaration brought tears to Irene's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to add to his concerns. You should rest more. Your body needs time to heal. So does yours, he pointed out. When did you last sleep in a proper bed? I'm fine, Ezra. No, you're not. His tone brooked no argument. I can see how exhausted you are, Irene. The dark circles under your eyes, the way your hands tremble slightly. His gaze softened. Please, for my sake, if not your own, get some real rest. I promise not to die while you're sleeping. The gallows humor, so typical of Ezra, broke through her resistance. Very well, but only for a few hours, and Martha will sit with you. Agreed. He closed his eyes, already drifting toward sleep himself. Love you, he murmured as he dozed off. I love you too, she whispered, bending to kiss his forehead, before finally seeking her own much-needed rest. The storm passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape buried under fresh snow, but bathed in brilliant sunshine. As March progressed, Ezra's recovery continued steadily. He chafed at the restrictions Irene placed on his activities, but grudgingly admitted the wisdom of allowing his body time to heal properly. The men are managing fine without you for a few weeks, she reminded him when he grew particularly restless. Sam has everything well in hand. It's not about the work, Ezra admitted one afternoon as they sat together in the living room where he had progressed to spending a few hours each day. It's about feeling useful. A man needs purpose. I understand, Irene said, setting aside her mending. Perhaps there's a compromise. You could review the accounts plan for the spring cattle drive, consider how to adjust operations during the railroad construction. The suggestion brightened his mood considerably. That's actually a good idea. Mental work if I can't do physical labor yet. Exactly. She smiled, pleased to have found a solution that preserved both his health and his dignity. And you can dictate letters to me for the railroad company and suppliers. Planning ahead will make the transition smoother when you're fully recovered. They settled into a new routine with mornings devoted to ranch business conducted from the living room, afternoons for rest and recovery, and evenings spent together by the fire, often with Martha joining them for reading or music. Ezra's strength returned gradually, and by late March he was able to take short walks outside his arm, still bound in a sling, but his stride growing stronger each day. It was during one such walk with Irene beside him, and the first green shoots of spring grass poking through the melting snow, that Ezra paused to gaze across the awakening landscape of whispering pine. I thought I might lose it all, he said suddenly. When the railroad first came, I was certain it meant the end of everything my family had built. And then, when that beam fell, he shook his head. It's strange how facing loss makes you appreciate what you have all the more. Yes, Irene agreed softly, thinking of her own journey from the doctor's office in Boston to this moment. Strange, but also a gift in its way. It clarifies what truly matters. Ezra turned to her, his expression unusually vulnerable in the clear spring light. You know what I realized, lying there in that bed, not certain if the fever would break, that losing the entire ranch would be nothing, nothing, compared to losing you. The declaration, so heartfelt and unguarded, moved Irene deeply. "Oh, Ezra, I mean it." He took her hand, his grip strong despite his recent illness. "You came into my life when I least expected it, when I was determined to remain closed off from any real connection. And somehow, despite all my resistance, you found your way past every barrier I had built." "We found each other," Irene corrected gently. Two people who had stopped expecting happiness yet discovered it anyway. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The air was crisp, but carried the promise of warmth to come of renewal after the long winter. "About that celebration we were planning," Ezra said as they turned back toward the house, "I think we should schedule it for May. By then the roads will be clear for travel, the spring grass will be at its height, and—" He flexed his injured shoulder carefully. "I should be fully recovered." "May sounds perfect," Irene agreed. "The first Sunday in May, perhaps." "Perfect." He smiled down at her, the expression transforming his features in a way that still caught her by surprise sometimes. "A celebration of spring, of new beginnings, and of the miracle that brought you to Whispering Pine." As they walked home through the melting snow, hand in hand, beneath the vast Montana sky, Irene felt a deep contentment that transcended her physical condition, whatever the future held. The railroad's arrival, the progression of her illness, the unpredictable turns of life on the frontier, this moment. This connection was a gift beyond price. Outside, the first birds of spring called to each other across the awakening landscape, their songs a testament to life's persistence through even the harshest winters. Inside her heart, Irene carried a similar song, one of love discovered in the most unexpected place of healing, found not in a doctor's office, but in the arms of a man who had learned to live again because of her. Montana's winter had tested them both, but in its crucible, they had found something precious and enduring, a warmth that no cold could extinguish, a light that no darkness could dim. The spring renewal celebration at Whispering Pine, scheduled for the first Sunday in May, became the talk of Crow's Bend and surrounding ranches. Invitations were sent to neighbors near and far, preparations made for food and music, and the ranch house underwent a thorough cleaning from attic to cellar. April brought the expected mud season as winter's snow melted away, turning roads to quagmires and creeks to rushing torrents. But it also brought new life calves in the pasture's green shoots in Martha's garden, and a vibrant energy that seemed to infuse everything at Whispering Pine. Ezra's recovery progressed steadily. By mid-April, he had discarded the sling, though he still favored his left side when lifting or reaching. The head wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a faint scar at his temple that would eventually be hidden by his hair. More significant was the change in his demeanor, a new appreciation for life's simple pleasures, a patience he had not possessed before. "Near-death experiences have a way of shifting one's perspective," he commented when Irene remarked on this change. "What once seemed worth anger or frustration now seems trivial by comparison." Irene understood this transformation better than most. Her own brush with mortality had led her to Montana in the first place, seeking meaning in whatever time remained to her. Now, as spring blossomed around them, she found herself daring to hope for more time than she had been promised, perhaps much more. Her health had stabilized in ways the Boston doctor might have considered miraculous. The episodes of weakness and dizziness had become rare, her breathing easier, her energy more consistent. While she harbored no illusions about being fully cured, the underlying heart condition remained. She had begun to believe she might have years ahead, rather than months. This cautious hope was reinforced one afternoon in late April when Dr. James Montgomery, not the railroad representative, but his brother, a physician visiting from Denver, paid an unexpected call at Whispering Pine. "My brother mentioned your medical background, Mrs. Sullivan," he explained as Irene welcomed him into the living room. "And your condition. I hope you don't mind my presumption in calling, but as I was in the area consulting on another case, I thought I might offer my services." Irene, surprised, but touched by the gesture, glanced at Ezra, who nodded encouragingly. "That's very kind of you, Dr. Montgomery. I would welcome your opinion." The examination was thorough, but conducted with professional courtesy. Dr. Montgomery listened to her heart with his stethoscope, checked her pulse at rest, and after mild exertion, and asked detailed questions about her symptoms and their progression since the Boston diagnosis. "The condition is real," he confirmed when he had finished. "There is a definite murmur and enlargement of the heart, but I'm not convinced the prognosis you were given was accurate." Hope fluttered in Irene's chest. "What do you mean? Heart conditions such as yours can be unpredictable," Dr. Montgomery explained. "Some progress rapidly, others remain stable for years or even decades with proper management. Based on what you've described, your symptoms have actually improved since coming to Montana, which suggests your condition may be of the more stable variety." "Is that possible?" Ezra asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying his hope. The Boston doctor was quite definitive about the 6-month time frame. "Medicine is not an exact science, Mr. Sullivan, despite our best efforts to make it so." The doctor packed his instruments back into his bag. "Mrs. Sullivan's condition is serious, but not necessarily terminal in the immediate future. With proper care, avoiding excessive exertion, maintaining good nutrition, rest when needed, she could live for many years yet." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Irene felt tears spring to her eyes. Tears of relief and cautious joy. Ezra moved to her side, taking her hand in a grip that conveyed everything words could not. "Thank you, doctor," she managed when she had composed herself. "Your assessment means more than I can express." "I've written some recommendations," Dr. Montgomery said, handing her a folded paper. "Medications that might help activities to avoid signs to watch for that would indicate deterioration. I'll be returning to Denver tomorrow, but you're welcome to correspond with me if you have questions or concerns." After the doctor had departed, Irene and Ezra sat together in a silence charged with emotion, the paper of recommendations clutched in her hand like a talisman. "Years," Ezra said finally, his voice husky. "Not months. Years." "It seems so," Irene replied, still scarcely able to believe it herself, though he was careful not to make absolute promises. "Even so," Ezra lifted her hand to his lips. "Even the possibility is more than we had yesterday." That evening, they shared the news with Martha, who burst into tears of joy before bustling to the kitchen to bake a special dessert in celebration. The ranch hands, who had come to regard Irene with protective affection, received the news with whoops and cheers when Ezra announced it at breakfast the following morning. "Knew you were tougher than you looked, ma'am," Sam declared, his weathered face creased in a broad smile. "Seen it from the start." The news added an extra layer of meaning to the upcoming celebration. What had begun as a renewal of vows and acknowledgement of spring's return now took on the character of a celebration of life itself, of second chances and unexpected blessings. As May approached, preparations accelerated. The weather cooperated beautifully with warm sunshine, drying the mud and coaxing flowers from the earth. The ranch buildings received fresh paint where needed fences were mended, and the yard swept clean of winter's debris. Inside the house, Martha directed operations with renewed vigor, her arthritis temporarily forgotten in the excitement. Windows were washed until they sparkled floors, polished silver, cleaned and linens pressed. Irene and Martha planned an elaborate menu featuring spring lamb fresh bread and early vegetables from the kitchen garden. 3 days before the celebration, a letter arrived that threw all these careful preparations into momentary disarray. It was addressed to Ezra in a feminine hand he didn't recognize, postmarked from Denver. Irene was arranging flowers in the dining room when he opened it, his expression changing from curiosity to shock as he read. "Ezra, what is it?" He looked up, his face pale. "It's from Rebecca." Irene set down the flowers, her heart suddenly racing. "Rebecca, your former wife?" "Yes." He handed her the letter, his hand unsteady. "Read it." The letter was brief but momentous. Ezra Wright, with news that may come as a shock. Robert died 2 months ago of pneumonia. In his final days, he urged me to contact you regarding Edward. Your son is now 8 years old and deserves to know his true father. If you wish to meet him, we will be traveling through Montana in mid-May on our way to visit family in Oregon. We could arrange to stop in Crow's Bend. I understand if you choose not to respond. What I did was unforgivable, and I claim no right to your time or consideration. This offer is made solely for Edward's benefit. Rebecca Irene looked up from the letter, searching Ezra's face. "Your son," she said softly. "After all these years." 8 years. Ezra's voice was distant, as if he were speaking from across a vast chasm. "He's 8 years old, and I've never seen his face." "What will you do?" Irene asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. This was his decision, one that would impact him profoundly, whatever choice he made. Ezra paced the room, agitation evident in every line of his body. "I don't know. Part of me wants to meet him more than anything, to see if he has my eyes, as she wrote in that one letter years ago. To know something, anything about him." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "But another part of me is afraid. What if he hates me? What if he's been told I abandoned them? What if he's been waiting his whole life to meet his real father?" Irene suggested gently. "What if this is a chance to heal an old wound for both of you?" Ezra looked at her vulnerability naked in his eyes. Would you mind if I arrange to meet them?" "Mind." Irene crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers. "Ezra, this is your son. A child you've thought about every day for 8 years. Of course I don't mind. In fact, I think you should invite them to our celebration." "Oh, the celebration?" Ezra looked startled. "But that's meant to be about us, about our future together. And what could be more fitting than including your son in that future?" Irene squeezed his hands. "He's part of you, Ezra. That makes him part of us, part of whatever future we're building here at Whispering Pine." The tension seemed to drain from Ezra's body. He pulled Irene into a fierce embrace. "What did I do to deserve you?" he murmured against her hair. "You advertised for a sturdy woman of good health," she reminded him with a laugh, "and got me instead." "The best mistake I ever made," he replied, drawing back to meet her gaze. "You're sure about this? About inviting them to the celebration?" "Absolutely sure," Irene affirmed. "Write to Rebecca today. Tell her we would be honored to have them join us." Ezra's reply to Rebecca was dispatched that same day via special messenger to ensure it reached Denver before she and Edward departed for Oregon. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of tension, anticipation mixed with anxiety, as Ezra alternated between excitement at the prospect of meeting his son and fear that Rebecca might change her mind. "What if he doesn't like me?" he asked Irene late one night as they lay in bed, the question revealing a vulnerability few ever glimpsed in the strong, self-sufficient rancher. "He'll like you," Irene assured him, nestling closer. You're his father. There's a connection there that transcends time and separation. I know nothing about being a father, Ezra confessed. My own died when I was nearly grown. I have no experience with children, especially not boys Edward's age. You'll learn together, Irene said. That's how all parents do it, whether they're there from birth or meet their children later. The day of the celebration dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring blossoms across whispering pine. The ranch was at its best, buildings freshly painted, yard-swept clean garden beginning to green with new life. Inside the house, Irene dressed with particular care in a new gown of pale blue silk that Martha had helped her sew. It was more elaborate than anything she had worn since coming to Montana, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and a modest bustle that nod to Eastern fashion while remaining practical for ranch life. "You look beautiful," Martha declared as she helped Irene with the final touches. "Like a proper rancher's wife, but with Eastern refinement." "Thank you, Martha." Irene turned to survey herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the vibrant woman who looked back at her. Gone was the pale, fragile creature who had arrived at Whispering Pine last autumn. In her place stood someone stronger, more confident, her cheeks flushed with health and happiness. "Do you think Ezra will approve?" "Approve," Martha snorted. "The man can barely take his eyes off you when you're in your work dress. He'll be struck dumb when he sees you in this." Martha's prediction proved accurate. When Irene descended the stairs to where Ezra waited in the entry hall dressed in his best suit, his expression transformed from nervous anticipation to stunned appreciation. "Irene," he breathed, taking her hands as she reached the bottom step. "You're a vision." "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Sullivan," she replied, taking in his freshly trimmed hair and beard, the crisp white shirt beneath his black suit coat. "Very handsome indeed." The first guests began arriving at noon, neighboring ranchers and their families' townspeople from Crow's Bend, the railroad executives who had become unexpected allies in recent months. Judith Blackwood made a striking entrance in a burgundy riding habit, having chosen to come on horseback rather than in her usual buggy. "Irene, you look wonderful," she greeted her hostess with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Thank you, Judith. I'm so glad you could join us." Irene had come to appreciate the complex woman who might have been a rival, but had instead become, if not quite a friend, at least a respected acquaintance. As the celebration got underway, Irene found herself constantly scanning the arrivals for signs of Rebecca and Edward. Ezra did the same. His conversation with guests distracted his gaze repeatedly, drawn to the road leading to the ranch. By 3 o'clock, with most guests already present and no sign of Rebecca's party, Ezra's anxiety was palpable. "Perhaps they changed their minds," he said quietly to Irene as they stood together greeting late arrivals. "Or perhaps the letter was a cruel joke." "Give them time," Irene counseled. "Travel is unpredictable, especially with a child. They'll come." As if summoned by her confidence, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a carriage approaching from the direction of town. Ezra stiffened beside her, his hand finding hers in a grip that conveyed both hope and fear. "Is that them?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I believe it is," Irene replied, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Remember to breathe my love." The carriage drew closer, finally pulling up before the house. The driver, a hired man from town, hopped down to open the door and assist the passengers. First to emerge was a woman in her early 30s, slender and elegant, in a traveling suit of gray wool. Her blonde hair was arranged in a fashionable style beneath a small hat, and she moved with the grace of someone accustomed to being observed. Rebecca Irene thought studying the woman who had once been Ezra's wife. She was beautiful, certainly, but there was a brittleness to her beauty, a carefully maintained facade that suggested vulnerability beneath. Following Rebecca was a boy of about 8, dressed in a suit that mimicked adult fashion in miniature. He had dark hair like Ezra's, and as he looked around curiously at the gathered guests, Irene caught her breath. The boy's eyes were the same striking blue as his father's Ezra's eyes, in a younger face. Beside her, Ezra made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. "Edward," he whispered, and Irene felt the tremor that ran through him at the sight of his son. Rebecca spotted them and hesitated briefly before approaching her hand on Edward's shoulder, guiding him forward. The boy looked up at his mother questioningly, clearly aware that something significant was happening, but unsure what it might be. "Ezra," Rebecca said when they stood before them, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for inviting us. This is unexpected." "Rebecca," Ezra's voice was equally measured. "Thank you for coming, and for bringing Edward." Rebecca turned to Irene, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You must be Ezra's wife." "I'm Rebecca Morgan, and this is my son, Edward." "Irene Sullivan." Irene offered her hand, which Rebecca took after a moment's hesitation. "I'm very pleased to meet you both. Welcome to Whispering Pine." Edward, watching this exchange with keen intelligence, looked up at Ezra with undisguised curiosity. "Are you really my father?" he asked directly, with a child's disregard for adult social niceties. A hush fell over the nearby guests who had overheard the question. Ezra knelt to bring himself to the boy's level, his eyes, so like Edward's own, filled with emotion. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Edward considered this with a thoughtful expression. "Mother said you live on a ranch with horses and cattle. Is that true?" "It is." Ezra gestured to the surrounding property. "This is Whispering Pine Ranch. It's been in my family, in your family, for 3 generations. The boy's eyes widened with interest. "Can I see the horses?" A smile broke across Ezra's face, transforming his features. "Of course you can." "Would you like to meet them now?" Edward nodded eagerly, then glanced up at his mother for permission. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead, but stay with your father." The simple acknowledgement seemed to ease something in Ezra. He stood and offered his hand to Edward, who took it without hesitation. "We won't be long," he promised Rebecca. "Just a quick tour of the stables." As father and son walked away together, their dark heads bent in conversation, Irene felt a profound sense of rightness. Whatever complications might arise from this reunion, this moment, Ezra meeting his son at last, was a healing long overdue. Rebecca watched them go, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "He's been asking about his real father for months," she said quietly to Irene. "Ever since Robert died. I should have done this years ago." "You're doing it now," Irene replied gently. "That's what matters." The older woman turned to study her more carefully. "You're not what I expected." "No. I thought Ezra would choose someone more conventional, a proper rancher's wife." Rebecca's assessment was frank, but not unkind. "You have an Eastern quality about you. Education, refinement." "I was a nurse in Boston before coming to Montana," Irene explained. "Life takes unexpected turns for all of us, I think." "Indeed it does." Rebecca glanced toward the stables where Ezra and Edward had disappeared. "I never thought I'd return here, never thought I'd see Ezra again, let alone—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Robert was a good man, but he was never the father to Edward that he might have been. Too concerned with business, with appearances. In his final days, he expressed regret about that." about separating Edward from his true father. The admission clearly cost Rebecca something in pride. Irene recognized the courage it took to acknowledge such a mistake. "Edward seems like a wonderful boy," she said. "You've raised him well." "I've tried." Rebecca's gaze returned to Irene, sharpening with sudden insight. "You suggested this, didn't you, inviting us today, making Edward part of your celebration?" "It seemed right," Irene replied simply. "Ezra has thought of him every day for 8 years, and every child deserves to know where they come from, who they truly are." "You're a generous woman, Irene Sullivan." Rebecca's tone held newfound respect. "To welcome your husband's former wife and child into your home, especially on a day meant to celebrate your marriage." "Family takes many forms," Irene said. "Edward is Ezra's son. That makes him family, however unconventional the arrangement." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Ezra and Edward, both looking considerably happier than when they had departed. Edward's eyes shone with excitement as he described to his mother the horses he had seen, especially Diego's prized stallion. "And Father says I can ride tomorrow, if you say it's all right," he concluded breathlessly. "Can I, Mother, please?" The word "father" on the boy's lips brought a visible sheen of tears to Ezra's eyes, quickly blinked away. Rebecca, noting this, smiled at her son with genuine warmth. "Yes, you may," she agreed, "if your father thinks you're ready." The simple exchange, laden with meaning beyond the mere words, marked a turning point. As the celebration continued around them, guests enjoying the food and music, children playing games on the fresh spring grass. Ezra, Irene, Rebecca, and Edward formed their own small island of reconnection. By evening, as lanterns were lit around the yard and musicians struck up tunes for dancing, Irene found herself standing slightly apart, watching as Ezra showed Edward how to feed a sugar cube to one of the gentler horses. The boy's laughter rang out bright and clear in the gathering dusk, and Ezra's answering smile was one of pure joy. Martha appeared at Irene's side, her aged eyes taking in the scene with approval. "That's a sight I never thought I'd see," she commented. "Ezra with his boy, almost like the years between never happened." "Almost," Irene agreed. "Though those years have shaped them both. The connection is there, but they'll need time to truly know each other." "Time," Martha repeated thoughtfully. "Something you both have more of now, thanks to that Denver doctor." "Yes." Irene touched the locket at her throat, Ezra's mother's locket, her Christmas gift from him. "Time enough for many things we didn't dare hope for before." As the evening progressed, Reverend Collins called for attention. The guests gathered in a circle around Ezra and Irene, who stood before the minister as they had at their wedding months before. But this time there was no uncertainty, no practical arrangement being formalized. This was a true celebration of love discovered in the most unexpected circumstances. "Friends and neighbors," the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "We are gathered here to witness Ezra and Irene Sullivan reaffirm the vows they made to each other last autumn. Then they were near strangers brought together by circumstance. Today, they stand before us as true partners, their commitment deepened by the challenges they have faced together and the love that has grown between them." The simple ceremony that followed moved many to tears. Ezra and Irene repeated their vows this time, with full knowledge of what they were promising for better or worse in sickness and in health, for as long as they both should live. When they kissed to seal their renewed commitment, the applause from the gathered community was thunderous. Among the cheering guests, Edward watched with wide-eyed curiosity, while Rebecca stood nearby, a bittersweet smile on her face. Later, as musicians played and couples danced on the makeshift floor set up in the yard, Ezra found a moment alone with Irene. They stood on the porch, watching the celebration they had created unfold before them. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his strength. "And you? How does it feel to meet your son at last? Like a piece of myself that was missing has been restored." Ezra's gaze found Edward, who was being taught a simple dance step by one of the ranch hand's daughters. "He's extraordinary, Irene. So bright, so curious. Rebecca has done well with him, whatever else happened between us." "What will happen now, with Edward, I mean?" "Rebecca and I talked while you were helping Martha with the food. She's planning to settle in Oregon, where her sister lives. But she's agreed that Edward can spend summers here at Whispering Pine beginning this year." Ezra's voice held wonder at this unexpected gift. "I'll have a chance to know my son, to teach him about the ranch, about his heritage." "That's wonderful news," Irene said sincerely. "He'll love summers here. What boy wouldn't?" "There's more." Ezra turned to face her fully. "Rebecca asked if you and I would consider traveling to Oregon for Christmas, to continue building this new family arrangement, whatever it might become." "Of course we should go," Irene replied without hesitation. "Edward deserves to have all the people who love him in his life, however